Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to the second annual, that's right, the second annual CPG and Multi-Brand Digital Analytics Summit. The InfoTrust team is absolutely thrilled to be back again this October after partnering up with Google on this venture in 2020. So very, very glad to be back. My name is Chase Howe, and I will be your MC for the day. I am the head of marketing at InfoTrust and coming to you from our office actually in Cincinnati, Ohio. I don't want to talk too much about InfoTrust, but we are a global end-to-end analytics and data governance consulting company that works with many of the world's most recognized CPG and multi-brand organizations, many of whom are in our audience today. So very happy to have our clients here. We are absolutely thrilled to have an all-star lineup of speakers for you today. If you could go to the next slide. That includes Joanna Goldblatt and Ben Fisher from Google, Shafi Coker from GSK, and former Estee Lauder VP of Global Data Experiences, Keston Femisone. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we have an awesome lineup of speakers for you. Among the many topics relevant to CPG and multi-brand organizations that we will be talking about include Google Analytics 4, current and upcoming privacy requirements, and server-side GTM. We will be sure to incorporate lots of breaks for you all in between these sessions. We know a virtual conference can sometimes make your brain a little fuzzy after a while, so we want to make sure you have time to step away from your computer, grab a coffee, grab a tea, get something to eat. So lots of breaks coming your way, so don't worry about stepping away while a session is going on. Next slide, please. Obviously, this event would not be possible if it were not for you, our awesome attendees. Here's a snapshot of the many brands that are represented here today in our audience. So we are extremely thankful for all of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us, and we certainly hope that you find value in the upcoming sessions. Before we get started, I did want to cover just a few housekeeping items. So we are giving away a copy of the Amazon best-selling book, Crawl, Walk, Run, to all attendees. To claim your copy, you will need to fill out a form that is in the YouTube live chat. So please click that link. This is also important that you fill this out because it will let us know that you're actually here and attentive. Remember, we are giving away a Peloton. That's right, a Peloton at the end of today's summit to one lucky attendee who has stayed with us through the entirety of the day. So please fill that out. We'll send out a couple of reminders through the first session, but super excited to give away a Peloton and books. Speaking of participation, please be active in the YouTube live chat. You saw the number of brands that are present today. Please continue to pick the brains of your fellow CPG and multi-brand colleagues. We want this to be as engaging as possible for a virtual summit. And we definitely will have a number of our own InfoTrust team members in the chat as well to answer your questions. And then finally, let's have fun. So I'm going to get right into it. For our keynote, I am very thrilled to welcome Joanna Goldblatt of Google. Joanna leads Google's data and technology team and works with organizations across the consumer, government, and entertainment industries. She is a 14-year veteran of the digital advertising space and helps make large teams adapt to new ways of operating. Joanna specializes in guiding marketers to improve measurement and audience identification capabilities and to prepare for increasing user privacy requirements online. Joanna holds a degree from Dartmouth College and lives in beautiful Los Angeles, California. Joining Joanna is InfoTrust's Chief Growth Officer, Michael Loban, and Michael is coincidentally a co-author of Crawl, Walk, Run, the book that we just talked about. So I am going to send it now to Joanna and Michael.
Chase, thank you so much. Hi, Joanna, how are you?
Hi, Michael. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me today. I can't wait to see who wins that coveted Peloton on the other side of this.
Absolutely. Thrilled to have you and thrilled for our second CPG and multi-brand event. And what is happening in the industry these days, so a lot for us to discuss and figure out what to do next. But maybe before we start talking about the trends, the analysis, and what we should be doing, perhaps you can share a little bit more about yourself and what inspires you in the work that you do at Google.
Absolutely. So for those in the group who I don't know, I lead a sales organization. And as Chase mentioned, we help the industry and the marketers navigate the immense change that's in front of us. And when I think about, I'm passionate about leading through change. And what's so profound about the world that we're living in right now is that change actually really unites and unifies all of us. So I think at a macro level and what we're all experiencing, the way that we understand, the pandemic that we're in right now has changed through the course of 2021. More specifically in the digital marketing evolution, we know that change is coming. We know it's underway. The timeline of that change has changed during the course of the year. So it's something we've had to continue to adapt around. And then for the CPG attendees here, your industry in particular is changing so rapidly around different consumer expectations and behavioral patterns. And I know this is something that you're confronting day in and day out. So really, it is a time of change for all of us personally and professionally. It unifies us. It's the opportunity and the responsibility for everybody here.
I like that, opportunity and responsibility. And my hope is that by the end of the session today, everyone has at least a list of opportunities that we can focus on in the days to come. Certainly, you've mentioned the changes that are happening in digital marketing. We see them in customer ecosystem, consumer experience. We see them. But from your vantage point, how do you feel these changes are impacting CPG space in particular, and certainly attendees from many of those CPG organizations that we have at today's event?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, let's talk about the opportunity and the responsibility for CPG marketers in particular. The opportunity. In 2020, e-commerce growth rose more in a 2-month period than it did in the prior decade combined. So that is the opportunity as CPG marketers that are present today. That's the opportunity that you're faced with. It's immense. The responsibility. 70% of consumers say that they expect personalized experiences when they go online. They want you as a brand to know what they're interested in and to speak to them in a really personalized and meaningful way. However, 80% of those same consumers say that they really care deeply about how you as a brand are collecting and transacting with their data, and that if they don't feel like they have the full information set about how their data is being used, they will inherently lose trust and support for your brand in the long run. So again, when we square together the opportunity with e-commerce and all of the changes happening with consumers moving online, the responsibility for you as brand marketers is really tremendous in meeting them with responsible marketing, with transparent marketing, with a consent framework that really speaks to them and is understandable and attainable. And I know that's what we're all grappling with as the industry around us moves at such a rapid pace.
So if I understand correctly, the 4 key changes that you've mentioned, obviously e-commerce growth in 2020, within just a couple of months, we saw a massive increase. As more organizations, as more consumers start to buy online, there's a need and almost demand for personalized experience, data transparency, and the need for consent framework. And over the past 18 months, many executives, digital leaders have been focused on thinking through those types of changes. What do you see as some of the factors at play as CPG organizations begin to work on these 4 changing tides?
Absolutely. So the other dynamic, Michael, that we haven't talked about yet, but that I know is facing everyone in attendance virtually in the CPG space, is the global supply chain challenge. So we understand a lot of your organizations are facing supply chain challenges. And as marketers, what that likely translates into is a push for increased efficiency. So if supply chain is challenged, how can the marketing efforts that you're driving be even more efficient, even more profitable in order to drive the business forward right now? So we understand that's another dynamic facing CPG marketers today. And then on top of that, I think just to sort of underscore some of the digital trends that we're talking through, the online presence, the power of the digital storefront, and how you make the digital storefront one of your primary interaction points with your customer base. So really capitalizing on this trend of consumers moving online and using your online presence as a way to really control and own the message that you're giving them, to make sure that they have that consent, they understand how that data is being transacted, so that you can build trust and loyalty in the long run and do it in a way that really feels transparent and like a two-way transaction. And then finally, the last dynamic as we think about this shift to the digital marketplace is actually what we're calling omni-channel. So as consumers are using the online interface to do research, to experiment, trying on makeup perhaps, what they're ultimately doing still is sometimes shopping in store. We know that that means that you might have 5 or more touch points with a consumer along their journey that happen in different channel environments. And so the challenge as marketers is really continues to evolve to capture those consumers where they are, to understand the impact and the pathway that they're taking, and ultimately to connect the dots across that entire experience. So again, when we think about all of these dynamics together, the amount of change that your industries are facing are so tremendous. The pace with which this is happening is fairly unprecedented, and the opportunity is now to continue to capture all of this opportunity.
And I love your point about the opportunity, right? Because it seems like, yes, there are some organizations maybe that have done a better job, but there's still so many opportunities where brands and enterprises can capitalize on. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about what can be done next. And what have you seen successful brands do well that we can learn from?
So absolutely. I'm actually going to take a stab at answering this with a personal anecdote, since I don't know a lot of the folks in the crowd. So I am a 10-year sort of unnatural yogi. And so if anyone here in the group practices yoga, hopefully you can relate with to this. So I've played sports my whole life, and I'm inflexible. I'm often stressed out. It's hard to kind of turn down the noise sometimes at the end of the day. So again, an unnatural yogi. However, I've been practicing for 10 years. I love pushing myself in this capacity. And on a personal level, one of the most powerful moments that I experienced in my time practicing yoga was the first time I nailed the coveted headstand. So again, anyone here who practices yoga hopefully can relate.
Yes.
Oh, there we go. So how did I get there? I didn't just snap my fingers one day and go into a headstand position, right? It took a lot of time. It actually took a lot of really small motions. And in making those small motions, I was willing to falter a little bit. So I tumbled and I fell and I got back up. And over time, the sum of those small motions actually put me in a position to make a few really big motions and take a few really big risks and end up in that headstand at the right time. And I actually sort of relate that to my recommendation and my guidance for all of you here today, and how I'd love for you to walk away from this conversation and really thinking through how you bring this information back to your organizations, how you take some critical next steps, and how you try to galvanize other people around you to do the same.
So if we can unpack this a little bit, right? What does this look like in practice, right? How can we make those small steps, small millimeter changes? And the other analogy that I heard and I really like, if you're on a flight and those millimeter changes that the captain on the flight might make, right, is going to be the difference in your destination. So those small adjustments are extremely important in helping you land at the right spot. So what are some of the changes that team leaders, executives can be making?
Absolutely. And thank you, Michael, for adding another analogy so that the non-yoga practitioners in the group can relate to this. I much appreciated. Okay, so what does this look like in practice for marketers today? How do you land the equivalent of the coveted headstand in your digital practice in this time of change and opportunity? So we talk a lot at Google right now about the experimentation mindset. And experimentation is really required when there's no silver bullet. And for all of us working in this space today, I think we can all agree there certainly is no silver bullet. We're actually really far away from that. So what does an experimentation really look like in practice? What it looks like is an individual, you, an attendee of the InfoTrust CPG Summit, going back to your company and just identifying one very discrete, very specific problem. For example, we run an audience campaign and that strategy is cookie-based and it won't work in the future. Or we have a measurement foundation that relies on third-party cookies, and therefore in the future, we're not going to be able to record all of the attribution of our advertising campaigns against our online sales, right? So those are really targeted, specific questions that you can, problems and questions that you can ask your organization. I then channel Adam Grant, whose work I love, and he uses a framework called thinking like a scientist. I think that's very applicable here. How can you approach a problem like the ones I just outlined with a very clear question? For example, what could we stand up that will work in the future? What is an audience strategy we could enable that will work in the future? What are the foundational gaps in our measurement strategy that would fix our ability to measure in the future and retain our ability to record all online sales transactions? I love this approach because with a really clear question and an open mind, and I hope and expect that everyone on this call has that, you can start to identify the solutions that actually might fix it. So over time, if you run a small scale experiment like some of the ones I just mentioned or other things that really feel applicable within your organization, the result is thousands, ideally, thousands of small and not so small experiments that in sum together really can generate some huge benefits.
I love the idea of thinking like a scientist and having that experimentation mindset. And personally, when I work with at our own company and with our partners, our clients, this type of mindset really helps you frame. So, what is the outcome, right? What is it that we desire? Where do we want to land, if you will? And then, well, if we do not quite reach the goal, at the very least, we know, well, here is what happened and perhaps why we did not get there. And a lot of times, a campaign or marketing test possibly was successful, and then you're asking, so what do you think worked? And we don't know, right? Because, well, let's try this, let's do this, and we'll see what happens. Unless you really know what you're after and what you're going to measure or what the expectation is, right? It becomes then difficult to repeat that success. And that's ultimately what I think we want.
Absolutely. And I think, it's important for everybody here to walk away with a taste of some of these experiments. I'm happy to throw out a few more that people can really sort of digest and process as you think about how you can bring this back to your organization and infuse it in your day-to-day operations in terms of standing up these small experiments. So I really encourage everyone who's here to think about some of these key considerations. For example, is the consumer really at the center of your strategy? So would you as a marketer feel comfortable giving your personal information to your company in the way it stands right now? If not, what are the improvements that you feel like you need to make in order to have that personal comfort level to really create that value exchange? I think if the answer is yes, you would give your personal information as it stands now, then you're on a really great pathway to having the consumer at the center of your strategy. And my question for you would be, what more do you do with it? What are the little experiments that you can lead and generate and run forward with that really help make use of that highly valuable, highly consented value exchange consumer information? The second question that I would really encourage everybody to walk away thinking about, in addition to if the consumer is truly at the center of your strategy, is whether you are thinking long-term and respecting the true opportunity that lies ahead. And I know this is really hard with quarterly goals and expectations that everybody also has. But as you're making day-to-day decisions, I encourage you to really check yourself. Are you planning just for today? Or is the focus in your work also in the spirit of creating sustainable solutions that set your business, your division, your team up for sustained long-term success? And if the answer is that all the decisions you make are in service of today, and they will actually fall apart in the long run, I think it's a really great time to think about the experiments you could run alongside the in-quarter goals you need to hit today that can help start to create a sustainable long-term pathway for your marketing organization to be successful. You have that responsibility to your team, to your organization, to your consumers to be thinking in the long term in addition to the short term. So if you have these kind of questions framed up, ideally then that can lead into some of these small experiments. And so just to give a few more examples, If you feel like that, you need to be a little bit closer to the consumer to get that value exchange that allows them to transparently give their information, their first-party data to you, what's a small-scale test that you can launch in one market, one division, that could really give you some answers? So, one example, you could tap into your consumer insights team. What can they share with you about what makes consumers in that market really connect with your brand, right? So what are some insights that can be brought forward to your marketing team from other groups within your organization that allow you to create marketing programs that really speak to that connection? Similarly, if you're deciding that you want to rely more on machine learning experimentation to supplement some audience targeting strategies that won't last in the future, what are the right outcomes that you need to measure that against that move your business forward, that allow for machine learning to be evaluated as a successful mechanism for the long-term sustainable marketing that you're driving? So those are just a few examples. I will always want to call out where I see this working so well in the CPG space. And Google recently published a thought leadership piece with the marketing team at Mondelez. Mondelez led their Empathy at Scale initiative, which is sort of the evolution of their personalization goal. But before they could do it, they actually realized they needed to re-architect their digital advertising infrastructure. They didn't have the ability to have the right naming conventions, hierarchy to really understand how their ads connected with their consumers. And so they took that small step first to then be able to launch the large program that allows them to continue their personalization journey in a way that's really durable and meaningful in the long run. So I encourage everybody to think about those types of experiments that you could run within your organization, your group, your division, your region, to start to work toward a similar place.
As you were sharing this, I was taking notes just to make sure I don't miss anything. And for the audience, just to make sure that I captured everything the right way, and the audience can hopefully leverage these takeaways, is number one, almost thinking about, would you do this yourself, right? If there is a value exchange that you have set up on the website, if you come to this website as a consumer, would you fill out this form? Would you give access to your information? The next one is thinking long-term and sustainable. Yes, there are some metrics and some experiments that I presume would be short-term, and we would have short-term results, but we need to balance it with a long-term strategy and where we want to be within the next 3, 6, 9 months. And then when we have the right outcomes and what we want to measure, we know what success looks like, then the question will become what type of technology stack we need to have, what type of team composition we need to have to bring this to life, similar to how, if I understand you correctly, how Mondelez has done it, right? They declared, here's where we want to be as a company, and then they re-architected their stack to get there.
Absolutely. And as everybody on the call is sort of listening to this information, I imagine you're at different stages in all three of these categories. So as you walk away from this and think about what are the experiments that you can bring back to your teams, how far are you along in this journey, right? If you fixed the user consent challenge and you feel like the information you're getting is valuable and transparent, what are you going to do with that information? How do you take that to populate your next campaign? And then what do you want to learn from that to understand the gaps and the next set of opportunities there to go out and capture more consented consumer information in the right places and the right channels? So just some thought starters to think about the avenues to pursue. And as you go along the journey, the idea is that you'll ultimately identify new opportunities, new challenges within your organization. In sum, tackling each of those opportunities individually with a really scientific approach will help you make the big, meaningful change over time.
And one thing that we've also noticed, sometimes turning this type of experimentation almost into gamification type of environment, right? Where everyone can get together in a room, people start brainstorming different ideas of things that they would want to experiment, and then ranking them based on their possible outcome and what they want to learn, can also ignite this within the organization. But let me ask this question. A lot of times when we talk about experimentation, when I speak at some summits, the question comes up, this might not work in our organization, or our company just does not think that way. How would you help people attending this event frame these types of questions, these experiments at their companies?
Yeah, so again, I want folks on this call to feel empowered to walk away, to run the smaller experiments, within your remit, within your control, that get you closer to this ideal standard of the consumer being at the center of all of this and of having a really viable long-term play. However, this is where we come back to the headstand analogy. So in order for me to land the headstand, I had to do a series of very small steps. I had to be willing to falter and fall, but I did need to make a few really large calculations in order to ultimately nail the pose. And that's where you do need to challenge the status quo of the organization. And if the organization will not accept some of these, what I call truths and hard truths, it's time to really take a step back and understand how far the organization wants to move and adapt to get to the future and to get to a consumer-centric strategy. So what are the areas where we really need to be asking those questions to identify the truths and the hard truths? The consumer at the center of the strategy. Do you have a people-first marketing strategy? What's the truth? So the truth is that, as we've been talking about, consumers really want transparency, and they want control, and they want choice when it comes to privacy and how their information is consented. But the hard truth that your organization needs to be asking is that anything that does not respect those terms will not be sustainable. In other words, if your organization cannot respond to those consumer demands, over time, you will lose those consumers to other brands that meet them where they want to be met. That is the hard truth. And if your organization isn't accepting of that and building strategies and plans to get there, these are the right questions to really be asking over the long run. When we think about building the long-term sustainable strategy that not only helps you hit quarterly goals, but really helps you build a business for the future, the truth is that we're not just rebuilding technology policy with cookie deprecation and regulatory changes. We are reshaping, re-engineering how an entire ecosystem operates. And that is the challenge that we all work through. But the hard truth here that I encourage everybody to think about through the rest of the day is that the ecosystem that we all work in has run on a cookie economy since 1995, and it's time for a change. It has to be reinvented. It has been reinvented. It will be reinvented. We are living in this. And you don't progress if you're just trying to replicate the past. You progress if you understand where the dynamics in the market are moving, and you think faster and more strategically to get there than your competitors. And then finally, the third area where I encourage you, go back to your organization, and if you don't see them asking these questions, challenge it, bring it forward, make sure people are thinking and talking this way. Creating a culture where it's okay to fail. So again, to go back to the headstand analogy, I had to fall a bunch of times in order to get there. Your organization will too. Is that okay? Is that permitted? Is there space for it? On the other side of a failure, is there a learning? And what's the process for people to acknowledge that the learning is really valuable too? That's the truth. People need to get comfortable with innovation, experimentation, and failure. And if that's not happening today, that's a great question to be raising internally. But the hard truth that if your organization is afraid of failure and can't innovate because of that fear, you will be caught flat-footed in a year or so time when cookie deprecation happens and the industry has fully turned on its side and everything needs to be re-engineered. So I encourage you to ask yourself as you step away from this conversation, is your organization really ready for this? If you go and you run the small experiments that are within your domain to answer really targeted and precise questions with the goal of the value of those things incrementing over time, organizationally and culturally, is the team around you ready to move forward? And if they're not, those are the hard truths to bring back to them. And if they are, then we look forward to learning from you, to seeing how you set the pace. We hope to feature you in a case study in this session in a year. We're here to partner with you as you go forth.
And a lot of times I think when people mention, well, it's not okay to fail in our organization. Well, if it's not okay to fail, is it okay to learn, right? Because I don't know how you can do one without the other. So we have to be mindful that, I mean, really, what is failure? Failure is we did not reach the desired outcome, but if our desired outcome is to learn something new about our consumer, if our desired outcome is to understand how would consumer respond to this type of messaging versus this type of messaging, it's not failure, right? It's all about learning, and it's all about even taking a step further. It's all about our understanding, right? All we want to do is have a series of experiments and tests where we can be better at understanding what our consumers are asking for, so we can actually meet them where they want to be met. And I remember years ago, I was reading a book about Jeff Bezos, where he famously would have a cutout of a consumer in the boardroom to represent the voice of the customer. And interestingly enough, not too long ago, I was chatting with another chief digital officer at an organization, and he was mentioning that now when they talk about site experimentation, or when they talk about changes that they have, their question is, well, what would this consumer do, or how would this consumer possibly react to this? So always to be very mindful of that. What are we doing this for? Seems like a message that should resonate with people working on this.
Absolutely. And I think just going back to what we were talking about earlier, Michael, with the amount of consumer behavioral change that has happened over the past 18 months and will continue to happen, it's nearly impossible as marketers to expect and anticipate exactly how that will pan out. But if you keep consumers' best interests and motivations at the center of the plans you're making, that's your best chance at really capturing them in the most authentic way and building a future with that consented first-party data framework and really being able to evolve your brand over time. So again, the consumer at the heart of your strategy will never serve you wrong. Thinking for the long term will create the trailblazers and the innovators in this space, and we're so excited to see what you do there.
And as enterprises are beginning to roll this out and work on this, from your standpoint, what role do partners like InfoTrust play in helping organizations navigate these challenges and, most importantly, opportunities?
So absolutely. So if we think back to some of the CPG trends that we discussed, global supply shortage right now is really pushing for all of the marketing organizations that we partner with for efficiencies. So when I think about the role of InfoTrust, I think of InfoTrust as expert in having vast industry knowledge and being able to deploy that at a much faster pace with greater precision for the benefit of the organization to learn and iterate from at a greater velocity. And what better time than a time when you're pushed for profitability than to bring in an expert to learn from quickly, right, to be able to innovate and iterate from the work that InfoTrust can bring in the right ways for your organization. The time is now. So we think the role of partners is so tremendous to scale, to move fast, to sort of learn and create a bridge for the industry back to the specifics of your organization. And I obviously can't say enough great things about the partnership between Google and InfoTrust. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think one of the things that continues to resonate with me is really having a consumer-centric mentality, right? And many organizations say that, but equally, it seems like many organizations might say it or hear this, but not knowing what does it really mean. Is it possible to maybe break this down? Like when we are thinking about consumer centricity, what are the 2 or 3 things that organizations can really do to be in a place where they're consumer centric?
So I think the first thing is transparency. So for any goal that you as an organization have in understanding your consumer behavior, your consumer database, check yourself if your consumers feel like they want to give that information to you and know that you have it, right? And then I think the second component is the application of it, right? So if we go back earlier, we were talking about 78% of consumers wanting a personalized experience, wanting a digital environment that really speaks with them and connects with them. So the second piece of this is, what do you do with it, right? So how do you build it into your media strategies, your sort of measurement strategies, and how do you understand what is the effectiveness, what is the outcome for my business when I take this transparent, fully consented consumer information and I bring it back to them with value? Because I think once you understand the outcome, you can then understand the scale. You can then understand where you want to go with it and how you want to broaden it. And ultimately, that's how you create long-term sustainable impact for your business.
And so if I understand correctly, especially as everyone is talking about first-party data strategy and how do we become better at collecting first-party data, is, well, one is, in order for us to collect it, we have to be absolutely transparent about what is our intent when we collect that information and how we collect that information. Once we have that information, let's be very smart in how we apply that information, whether it's for personalization or in other ways that our consumers would expect and want from us. And then finally, well, then it's time for us to measure how well it has worked.
Absolutely. And I think as the space evolves and the consumer opportunity evolves, as CPG marketers, hopefully you can get more of their information. However, in the interim, we're leaning on machine learning capabilities, leaning on insights generation and extraction to create that scale so that this really can power your large marketing strategies is critical. And again, as Google and InfoTrust, we look forward to being partners in that with you.
Absolutely. And if there's one thing that really stood out to me in this discussion is kind of the word opportunity, right? And yes, there are changes that are opportunities for us to act on, but also from the technology standpoint, you've mentioned machine learning, AI. There are so many new tools that are opportunities for us to play with them and capitalize on the advances in the technology in the measurement space that are now available to us.
Absolutely. And what I'll share with everybody as you walk away, the opportunity is tremendous. It can also feel overwhelming. Focus on the small motions to get to the headstand. So focus on the individual things that you can stand up within your remit, within your, the brand that you own, the region that you own, to get a little bit closer and then understand what the outcomes and what the learnings are from that as you try to drive that at greater scale over time.
So do not stress about this. There are plenty of opportunities. And if you do find yourself in a stressful situation, there's always yoga.
There's always yoga. Take it from me.
Thank you so much, Joanna. What a way to kick off our event today. I appreciate all the insights. I certainly have pages of notes. And now back to Chase.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joanna. I know I am getting dizzy even thinking about doing a headstand. So kudos to you for that accomplishment. That is awesome. So we have a session coming up in 15 minutes on privacy, and that is going to be led by our international group. So Shafi Kokar is coming to you live from the UK, and Lucas Long will be broadcasting from Barcelona. So very excited for that session. Thank you again, Joanna and Michael. This has been incredibly insightful. We are going to give everyone a break now. This is going to be the longest break of the day. We realize we are close to lunchtime for those attending in Eastern time and Central time. So give you a chance to go grab a sandwich, granola bar, whatever you fancy for lunch. One thing I did want to mention, actually a couple things before we go into the break. So first of all, the form. So we dropped a link to the form in the YouTube live chat. Many of you have filled it out. I greatly appreciate that. I just wanted to call it out one more time. This is super important because one, it tells us where to send your free copy of Crawl, Walk, Run, the Amazon best-selling book written by Michael Lobon here and Alex Yastrobinetsky. So definitely check that out. And then also, again, we are giving away a Peloton at the end of today's summit for those of you who stuck through the entire session. And to help us know that you are here, We'll be sending out a form now and a form at the end of the day. So definitely fill that out. And another thing, the chat. Thank you so much for everyone who has been super engaged in the chat to this point. Please continue throughout the day to also drop your questions for the presenters in there. Some of our sessions will have Q&A elements. Some of them, like I said, we have a few members of our InfoTrust team who are also engaged in the chat as well, so they can possibly answer your questions directly in the chat. With that, I will toss it to a break. And again, we will see you all in about 13 minutes now. So yeah, going to break. Thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you were able to grab lunch, grab a snack. We're going to dive right into our next session. So I'd like to welcome Shafi Koker, coming to us all the way from the United Kingdom. Shafi is the Global Director of Media, Technology, and Consumer Engagement at GlaxoSmithKline, and he has been with GSK for the past 3.5 years. Shafi is joined by our very own Lucas Long. Lucas is a tag governance specialist and product manager of Tag Inspector, and they are going to discuss how consumer privacy requirements are shaking up CPG digital marketing. With that, take it away, Shafi and Lucas.
Thank you very much, Chase, and thank you, Shafi, for joining me today for this discussion. I think whenever we're talking about these various different privacy requirements and what these changes are, some of the impacts, how we can mitigate them, it's best to start just thinking about the changes that are coming. So on this first slide, we'll kind of introduce the primary changes. The first one being consumer expectations. Without consumer expectations changing, no regulatory changes happen, no technical restrictions are really put in place. So we'll talk a little bit about those and then how that's shaking out. Number two are the regulatory changes that really flow from those consumer expectations. Lawmakers take notice. We're starting to see more laws such as GDPR in the EU and then patchwork privacy in the US with California, now Virginia, and Colorado all passing their own pieces of legislation. Even China getting into the mix with their new privacy laws set to go into effect at the end of this week, actually. And then third, as far as these changes go, we're all dealing with a lot of technical restrictions. So the deprecation of third-party cookies across all browsers by the end of 2023, according to Google's most recent updated timeline, as well as what we're already seeing within Safari, within Mozilla, and within Firefox for some of those restrictions on first-party cookies, as well as the effective deprecation of third-party cookies already. So the first change here, when we're talking about consumer expectations and just how large of an impact this really is, you'll see on this next slide just a few statistics that I think illustrate some of these points. The key one here is around 81% of people saying that the potential risks because of data collection outweigh the benefits. People are becoming more aware of what's collected, how it's used, and quite frankly, without the transparency necessary, they're afraid of what that impact is on them and feeling like negative impacts are going to come. We've seen this really, especially in the EU, across a number of different websites, and especially in the CPG space, with a large proportion of users that are not accepting consent, leading to large gaps in observable data collection on the various different websites. So Shafi, I'll start with just a question for you related to this phenomenon. How have you managed this observed change in the data with internal stakeholders that may not necessarily understand some of the nuance of why these things are happening and what it means for their various different activities?
Yeah. Lucas, first off, thanks for having me here, right? Really appreciate it. I'm going to go back a few years, right? When GDPR actually hit, right? There was a lot of chaos, right? And we had a massive drop in G8 data and, making those necessary changes to adapt and also at the same time changing vendors because we were seeing that, okay, it wasn't really working for us with the vendor that we originally chose. But managing that expectation internally was quite difficult, to be honest, right? Because suddenly you're going from seeing 100% monitoring to I'm only seeing about 13 people go on my website now. And, there's a lot of people complaining, right? Brand managers are coming to me and saying, hey, what's going on? I can't track anything. How am I supposed to retarget things? So it was a bit of an issue, but, managing their expectations, stating why it's dropped and the reason behind it. And at the same time, right, you have to keep on and continue on looking at the consumer at the heart. And that's key because that allows you to look at it from a consumer's lens. And going back to what Joanna said earlier, that, how would you feel comfortable giving the data away about yourself to that company? And it's about improving that experience for the user, focusing on doing A/B testing and optimizing the consent experience itself. That's key here. And going above and beyond and focusing on exceeding their expectations, that's the success, right? And the way that we did it, I'll give you an example, right, is we looked at mobile testing, for example, and simple A/B testing of moving the accept button to the right-hand side, because most people are right-handed. So naturally, person's thumb would naturally go to the right-hand side, and that'll be the fastest way to accept, to click on accept, right? Did that actually work? Is the hypothesis true that more people are likely to accept if we did that? Changing the background color of the actual button as well. Just doing those small tests helps to improve the acceptance rate, because you're making it easier for the user at the end to accept or decline.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember a lot of those tests taking place, and that kind of leads us directly into that next point and these changes that are happening around the regulatory updates. We can see here in this next slide just a brief timeline, and what's really important is we saw a lot of these regulatory changes beginning 2018 when GDPR went into effect. And then more recently, we're seeing a lot more different regulations go into place, updates to regulations. California, CCPA went into effect. And then already this past November, CPRA was passed to really enhance and clarify a lot of the requirements there. Now, with this increased pace of regulatory requirements and changes that are happening, especially for a global organization, working within all of these various different markets, and a lot of different nuance and requirements as to what opt-out means, what consent means, what language needs to look like on a consent banner, what does transparency mean, what all needs to be provided at the top level, at the second level to a user. With the varying nature of these global regulations, what are some of the core things that you're really looking for and asking of the different marketing and advertising technology platforms that you're using within the organization, just to ensure compliance and to ensure that the users' wishes are being respected as expected?
Yeah, so the key thing is governance, right? And we'll talk more about this in a bit. But it's about looking at any additional calls being made, i.e. piggybacking, that's associated with any of the platforms that we use. That's kind of critical, because we need to make sure that there's zero piggybacking happening off our pixels, because we need to know what's on our sites. Secondly, it's digging into the data that's being collected by each platform. Why are they needing this data? And having that governance around this. And what are they going to use it for as well? How are they going to use it, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's to ensure control throughout the entire architecture, right? So managing all the different digital platforms via one tag management solution, and having standards around that and deploying that across all your websites, right? At GSK, it's very complex because we have, I think when we did do this in partnership with InfoTrust, we had something like 1,300 websites. Thank God that's gone down to like 800 something now. But it's still a massive challenge, right? Irrespective of how many websites you have.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Understanding what's there, looking at any kinds of piggybacking and then putting controls around that to be able to not be surprised down the line. And also have a foundation of documentation to be able to inform any of those new regulatory changes or updates. Now, beyond just the regulatory updates, we're also obviously facing a lot of technical restrictions that are being imposed in order to really enforce those expectations of users and how those are changing and enforce user privacy, which net is a very, very good thing for the web at large. So when we're thinking about these technical restrictions, and you can see kind of supplemented on this timeline here, some of those different changes have gone into place. But the key implications here being that effectively third-party cookies, which are those, the IDs contained within them are used to join those data sets. So impacts on targeting, on measurement, and then duration restrictions on first-party cookies. Now, I know that specifically the third-party cookie deprecation piece here is very difficult for CPG organizations, just given the traditional lack of kind of personal relationships with users, not being as much of an opportunity for that one-to-one relationship and the ability to gain first-party identity with things like registration, signups, et cetera, when you're really just focused on brand websites. So I'm curious, how are you kind of approaching some of the challenges with privacy safe targeting, considering some of those limitations to the just broad recommendations for your industry specifically?
So you've hit the nail on the head. There is the most difficult problem being faced by CPG companies right now, right? Because like GSK, there's only a limited amount of first-party data that we have. So we can collect it to a certain degree, and we are looking at how can we improve that and increase that rate. But until then, there's other alternatives that we need to look at as well. And that's looking at, the likes of working with LiveRamp, for example. But having those low match rates, that's the questionable accuracy without third-party cookies at the moment. And once third-party cookies disappear, we need to do something about that, right? So it's just about testing various different approaches. And having talked to different CPG organizations myself, I was scared that it was only my organization that's going through this. But after speaking to various different CPG organizations and speaking to InfoTrust as well, we realized actually we're in the same boat as everyone else at the moment. So, which was a bit of sigh of relief, but at the same time, it's a bit scary, right? Because it's just around the corner. But just looking at those different identity solutions, looking at different targeting strategies, how do we activate across different publishing partners? So the likes of, in the US, we use Meredith in the US, right? So partnering with those kind of publishers globally. And then exploring how to best use second-party data, right? Now, second-party data can be, the terminology can be interpreted in various different ways. The way that I interpret second-party data is that it's someone else's first party, right? So for example, Google's automated solutions. And focusing on expanding that first-party identifiable data sets, very, very important, right? How are you going to do that? And this is something that's challenging for GSK right now as to how we collect that data, how we bring that in and raise the standards internally, right, as to how we can activate against that as well within the next few years. But again, sorry to be negative here, but yes, you're collecting the first party and you might have already some first party data, but how accurate is that first party data, right? That's still going to be a challenge no matter how we move forward.
Yeah, no, makes sense, especially with different solutions starting to be rolled out, like Apple with their different type of email solutions within iOS, where it's kind of that cat and mouse game, if you will. In any kind of a solution that's put forth, there is some sort of a protection or workarounds, I guess, to be able to address it. But I think that's really good advice there. Focusing on growing that first-party data set of identifiable users, and then testing different ways in which to activate it, including working with, even if we think of Google in like a publisher type of a context, a publisher with the largest reach on the web, and leveraging their first-party data through things like customer match and similar audiences to really expand on what you're able to do yourselves. So no, that's interesting and follows that theme, right, of testing various different approaches that we've looked at throughout today. Kind of moving on from some of these restrictions and the doom and gloom, I want to get your thoughts on some really core areas to focus on when we're thinking about navigating this new reality, and some of the really core takeaways for people to be thinking about following, and strategies, I guess, to be able to take away. So if we look at this next slide, the first key, and I know we've talked about this and we've done a lot of work together on helping to really gain visibility into the platforms, the data that's in use, and analyzing even advertising strategies. Joanna mentioned it before, but having that clear-eyed look at what strategies are reliant on technologies that are going away, what aspects of our measurement architecture are reliant on data that we might not have access to in the future due to some of those different regulatory requirements. With so many brands and so many markets, so many different countries that a global CPG organization is working with, it's difficult to have that visibility and understand what platforms are in use, how are strategies kind of differing from place to place, what behavior is allowed, where can I use cookies, where are consent requirements different. I guess, how have you approached that complexity and being able to get the necessary visibility in order to understand that current state to really develop, your roadmap that you're executing on moving into this future?
So it's been a long journey, right? We in the EU got a bit of a head start in comparison to other legislations like CCPA. But the first and foremost thing is doing an audit of what's on your sites, right? And trust me, it's scary because you think but when you do use tools like Tag Inspector and then you actually scrape and look at what's on your site, it can be a bit scary for some sites. And it was questionable and it was escalated to a certain degree internally here as well. But then once you've got that kind of visibility, you know what to do in terms of classifying those tags in a certain way, as however your privacy and compliance and legal team want to do that. But it gives you that kind of way to understand, audit, remove, include, whatever you want to do, right, in that sense. But also determining what regulations are applicable for each platform is a use case by case basis, right? But you're ensuring that there's legal compliance with those specific tags. And then having a post-audit, governance framework, per se, to ensure that you only have what's business critical on your platforms that's being leveraged, and removing anything else that isn't, right? And also having additional processes for any new platform as well. So, having a form to fill out by whichever platform it is, so that specifically this is being checked by a specific governance team, and you're literally checking through and making sure that this is compliant not only from media standpoint but tech and all the different teams as well within the organization.
Okay. No, that's interesting. I mean, you talked about it, auditing, understanding what's there, gaining that visibility, but then starting to take those deep dives into each platform, understanding how is this technology used, what data is being processed, what markets is this technology used within, what laws are applicable, and being able to answer those questions just as a current state to be able to inform compliance documentations, compliance actions, as well as some of those strategies moving forward that we're thinking about testing in order to be able to future-proof aspects of the strategy as well as the architecture for third-party cookies or lack of data due to consent. One thing that you kind of alluded to there is the second thing that I wanted to discuss here for navigating the new reality, and that is the definition of global standards. So once you have everything on the table, we've seen a lot of organizations get a lot of value in, defining what is approved from a platform standpoint, standardizing data models so that you can use just a central data object structure to inform everything and enable integration kind of down the line. And I know you've leveraged a lot of those things to really successfully grow that analytics and data maturity at GSK. What would you say have been the keys to building that solid, standardized foundation as your organization has moved forward with its digital maturity?
Governance. It's just having that kind of standard approach, including across all different teams, right? It's not a one team does this and that's it. It's legal, tech, marketing, compliance, privacy, media. Everybody has to join forces on this to make it a success, right? But it's about forming processes as well. So I mentioned, having forms to be filled out, etc. This isn't just a form that I filled out and I said, yeah, this is what we need. This is a joint effort between everybody to make sure that we have everything, and it ensures that every team is happy with what needs to be filled out for this as well, including our privacy and compliance, right? And vendors aren't happy about this, but at the same time, we're responsible for what's on our sites, right? If you're ever fined, hopefully we'll never get fined, but if you are ever fined because you're not making the consumers' lives easier, it's going to be your problem as a CPG. So that's where it's so important to be working closely with all these different teams internally, having that documentation for a platform to be approved and implemented. Look at specific use cases around data collected. So, I'm not going to name the vendor, but internally right now, we're looking at some vendors where how are they collecting the data? What are they going to do with it? How are they going to process it? Who's responsible for this, right? If something goes wrong, et cetera, et cetera. those things need to be discussed internally as well as with the partners themselves. And again, just ongoing monitoring of those tags and making sure that we're using Tag Inspector on a monthly basis across our entire portfolio to make sure that nothing has dropped or been added that we haven't been approved of, right? So having that kind of safe and block list is vital for the success of this. And lastly, it's consistency, right? So having that global data structure is very, very important. So what we've done is, just using Google Analytics, for example, we've rolled out something called Brilliant Basics. And what this is just, we called it Brilliant Basics, but it's just a standardization of all the data definitions and tracking requirements across all the digital properties so that everyone knows what they're looking for and how to compare, no matter what brand they're looking at. So it's that consistency. And that enables us to have integrations as well as with global comparisons, etc. And it just makes life a lot easier, right, to manage from a tech standpoint, but also if you're using Google Analytics itself as well, it just makes it really easy to digest that information. So it's having those basics, I would say, really helps with the process.
It makes a lot of sense. And that's, where those global standards, come in. Now, I want to follow up on one point there. You had mentioned about kind of like a governance team, right? And all the teams working in the same direction, which I think is extremely important, especially for marketers and advertising folks to remember, is that legal is not your enemy. Your competition is your enemy, right? So everyone is, focused on the same goals at the end of the day. And it's working within these new requirements and putting forth, doing, as Joanna had mentioned before, what would I be comfortable with? And making sure that you are following along those guidelines and you are following along the rules of the game as outlined by those different regulations. But for the team, as you're working with it, Shafi, do you have kind of a centralized global governance team that's with representatives from different parts of the business to define some of these standards and make sure everything is kind of up to snuff, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, we've got the team built. So what we've done is we've kind of Frankenstein model, brought everyone in, and just said, look, this is how we need to be working forward. And we've made this tagging governance team basically, which includes marketing, media, legal, compliance, you name it, basically is there, right? Tech, just to align on making sure that we have the right things, right, on our websites.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And it's something that I've seen be very, very effective as well across organizations, getting everyone, all the necessary stakeholders in one place and kind of regular connects in order to be able to, define these standards, understand what are we testing, what does success look like, what needs to change, and making sure all voices are heard when really defining those strategies moving forward. And that leads directly into the final point. And I know it's been brought up already and will be brought up more. But really that third key to navigating the new reality is that culture of testing. We can't really underscore enough that a lot is going to be changing over the next 18 months. If we really think about the end of 2023 as that really day of reckoning as it pertains to privacy, and focusing on how technologies are changing. Google and the Chrome team is still working on the privacy sandbox. So who knows what Fledge will look like for retargeting, potentially, at least for users within the Chrome browser. Who knows what targeting to cohorts maybe look like. Well, I guess in addition to that, also what ways of different measurement and how to measure the effectiveness of different strategies as you're running these tests, and also to measure the effectiveness of strategies in the future post third-party cookies. But as you're moving into this new environment with all the uncertainty around what parameters you'll be working with, what the technology will be able to do, how are you really thinking about testing specifically, trying different vendors as well as strategies as they emerge?
I was going to say, what's Flock and Fledge again? So every vendor that I speak to on a weekly basis is selling me their cookieless solution, right? Everyone's got one. And it's tough because you're spoiled for choice in a way as well, right? As to right, who do I use, what do I test with, etc. But you need to make sure that getting through that marketing messaging of a true approach is key here, right? That said, again, coming to your point, there needs to be a willingness to try, right? The only way you're going to do this is by experimentation, right? Because no one's got the answer right now. We're all trying to figure it out together. But we need to support one another. That's the thing, is that we're entering a world which is completely different now. We've never been there before, right? So we need to work together on this. And that's where I'm working with other CPG vendors as well, just to try and find out, like, how are they taking it? What are they doing? What approach are they taking? Am I the only one? And I've referred to this earlier, that we're all in the same boat together, but we can move forward together by sharing what we're going through. That's the only way you're going to find out is what's working and what's not working, is by testing, right? But then testing by market as well. So do it live, to within certain markets versus others. It's just dependent on the results of what you're going to get, and you're going to get different results in different markets. So that's why it's key to be testing as well. It's natural to roll out to the largest market, right? Just say, yeah, they've got the most money. Let's just test it there. But it's the main thing here is about adoption and full adoption of this, right, globally. And there's also a key thing, which, like I said, so many vendors coming. So there's no one-stop shop vendor out there that's just going to, sort all your problems out. Unfortunately, you're going to have to test a few, and there's going to be ones which are going to work in one market versus another, right? So you're going to have to look at those different vendors and different approaches, and see, what needs to be leveraged. What are you really looking at? And are you looking at exploring all those options and seeing what's that optimal mix, right? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 5? Is it 10? Right? That's the only way you're going to be able to do this. And we're currently going through that process right now of testing different vendors out there and saying, okay, this worked. We had X% match rate. Let's try this one. It might be better or something, right? In that cookieless world as well.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. I mean, testing both, as you mentioned, vendors as well as various different strategies, and then focusing on different ways of measuring that effectiveness that aren't reliant on the traditional kind of third-party cookie methods. So testing within a particular market, looking at incrementality for results and revenue, as well as even margins within that particular market, in order to be able to test the effectiveness of potentially a combination of different vendors and different strategies that are being used there. So all very, very illuminating. And I know quite a bit has been covered here. So just to kind of wrap a bow on everything here, we talked first about the different changes that are coming. So the consumer expectations, how those are changing, and how it's so important to put the consumer at the center of your strategy. Doing so via things like A/B testing and optimizing the consent experience of the user can increase those rates of proportions of consenting users to be able to get that fuller view of what's happening on our digital properties. We talked about some of the regulatory changes that are coming down gradually increasing. Shafi had mentioned how really focusing on understanding the underlying architecture of everything that you're using, understanding what those vendors are, having that solid documentation to be able to inform any changes and new requirements that really come up. We talked about the technical restrictions and focusing on that first-party strategy, testing different approaches, and then also testing things like second-party data. How can we then activate once we optimize just the volume of first-party data that we have? And then those 3 keys for navigating the new reality. Understanding where you are now, so you can create that roadmap, defining those global standards, doing that across the organization, having representatives from various different stakeholders and teams, and then instilling that culture of testing. So yeah, Shafi, thank you very much for kind of sharing some of these insights and some of these strategies as you're thinking about them. Very valuable, I know, for me, as well as for everyone else. And with that, we can kick it back to Chase.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Shafi, Lucas, thank you so much. That was an incredibly insightful session, and I think really resonates as well with a summit that we held back in June, a durability summit focused on privacy-centric marketing. The keynote for that event was Sean Downey from Google, and a quote that we actually have printed on t-shirts now is performance is not at odds with privacy. And I think that fits fairly well with what you were talking about. We are going to jump into another 5-minute break. So everyone, again, please go refill your coffees, teas, your beverage of choice, and we will be back at 1:30 to talk GA4. So exciting stuff. and welcome back. We have had 2 wonderful sessions so far and are about to dive into our third. So right now we're going to talk about one of our industry's hottest topics, the new Google Analytics, GA4. So to walk us through Google Analytics 4, I am pleased to welcome 2 of my colleagues at InfoTrust, Jimmy Love and Jake Allspaw. Both Jimmy and Jake work with our CPG industry team at InfoTrust and have already helped implement GA4 for some of the world's best-known CPG brands. So with that, I ask you all to please fire as many GA4 related questions into the chat as possible. There will be a time at the end of this session for some Q&A with Jimmy and Jake. So please, any question you have about GA4, please submit. And with that, take it away, Jimmy and Jake.
Awesome. Thanks for that intro, Chase. Before we get started, I did want to thank both Lucas and Shafi for their insightful commentary on navigating privacy laws and the new reality we're all living in, how these changes are shaking up CPG organizations when it comes to marketing and analytics. No matter how much I think I know about privacy from learning from them in the past, I always seem to learn something new when listening to those 2 brilliant minds talk about it. So appreciate that. But now we're moving on to a different but very related topic of digital analytics. So I'd like to introduce myself, Jimmy Love, and my colleague Jake Allspaw will be taking over for me shortly, both members of our CPG industry team here at InfoTrust. Next slide. In today's presentation, very excited to discuss Google Analytics 4 and what CPG organizations need to know about it. So first, what is GA4? Well, it's the next iteration of Google Analytics. So you can think of the ubiquitous universal analytics that we all know and love as essentially being GA3. If you're familiar with Firebase for mobile apps, GA4 combines the best of both worlds from universal analytics and Firebase. At initial launch, GA4 was actually called App Plus Web due to how brilliantly a GA4 property can combine data from multiple streams. But it truly is the next evolution of Google Analytics, whether you plan to use it on your organization's websites, applications, or as a combined data source for both. Right now, GA4 has not reached full parity with Universal Analytics yet, full feature parity, I should say. But it introduces new and improved features, some of which I'll be discussing today, and others that are still on the roadmap for the rest of the year and will continue to roll out in the first half of 2022. Next slide. In a much more visual manner, I do like this slide because it showcases how GA4 really is the best of both worlds when it comes to the features that, as I mentioned earlier, we know and love from Universal Analytics, but it steals the enormously successful events and parameters model that powers Firebase for mobile apps. Next slide. Most advanced analysts have some pain points with Universal Analytics, and Google seems to have addressed a lot of those headaches while planning and rolling out GA4. First, you may have had your apps and websites collecting data in separate platforms, as I mentioned, such as Universal Analytics and Firebase. GA4 actually resolves that with its unified event data collection model. Or perhaps some frustration with an excessively long ETL, extract, transform, load, for activating data and audience targeting. Now new and improved with predictive analytics for remarketing, while still keeping all of the media platforms like SA360, DV360, and CM, as well as ads, keeping all those media platform integrations intact with GA4. And in general, finding the answers to your CPG organization's questions in Universal Analytics can sometimes be a bit time-consuming, and sometimes honestly not even possible due to dimension scoping issues that may have occurred when you were implementing Universal Analytics. With GA4's hit-based event model, sorry, I lost track. With GA4's hit-based event model, custom reporting tends to be much more flexible. GA4 actually has an Explore Hub, which is basically a white space for reporting, where you can use it to create custom charts, tables, funnels, and path exploration. The latter, my personal favorite, the new path exploration reports, are an absolute game changer and a huge improvement over some of the behavior flow reports that we know from Universal Analytics, for example. Next slide, please. And just to quickly showcase how big of a difference an event-based model can make in simplifying reporting, many of the common data points we know so well from Universal Analytics have actually all been replaced with an event. So page views are now events, along with transactions, internal clicks, chat interactions, site searches, form submissions, customer reviews. Really just about any interaction on your website or app will now be an event with GA4. Mix in some parameters, which are basically additional information about an event, and you can get some of the same data points as Universal Analytics, but with a lot more simplicity and flexibility. Parameters really are key here, as they essentially replace the traditional category action and label that we apply to Universal Analytics events. Instead, we can now use a parameter to give us that extra information that we need to know about the events that are taking place, and we are not limited to just the 3 of category action and label. So if a user is watching a video event will fire, because that's an on-site interaction, and those are all events. And then parameters associated with that event can tell us, for example, the name of the video being watched, or what percentage was watched, or for example. And it's also worth noting that any event that you deem to be considered a high value action or a key performance indicator, a KPI on your website or app, can be configured as a conversion event, which has replaced what we know of as goals in Universal Analytics. So once again, we're not losing features or reports when you're migrating and looking at GA4 over Universal Analytics. We're just seeing some core differences in the data collection model, in the name and emphasis on flexibility and customizability. Next slide, please. And speaking of key differences between metrics in Universal Analytics versus GA4, here are some big ones that will change. Sessions do still exist, but you can kiss bounce rate goodbye, which is honestly very welcome news to any web analyst who knows how easy that metric is to manipulate. Session duration and average time on page are also replaced with much better engagement metrics, which is another simplified and welcome change in my opinion. Hopefully those of you that manage media campaigns are excited about the new remarketing opportunities that arise with all these new engagement metrics. And as a side note, the list here on the screen, it's not comprehensive, but it does help showcase, not a comprehensive list of all of the metrics and their replacements, but it does help showcase yet again that Google really is using GA4 and emphasizing simplicity and flexibility in this new web analytics platform. Next slide, please. And on the topic of simplicity, with Universal Analytics, we would often recommend implementing a standard list of events when talking to our CPG clients. Common events such as scroll tracking or outbound link tracking, video engagement, file downloads, and others in that vein. With GA4, it does seem like Google kind of heard our pleas. And instead of requiring us to add these custom events manually, they've given us the opportunity to simply toggle these common events on and off right in the GA4 interface. Jake will actually talk about the API a little bit more shortly, but since this summit is obviously aimed at CPG organizations with dozens or hundreds of websites, I'm excited to let you know that these automatically collected events, and known as enhanced measurement, can be enabled or disabled at scale via the GA4 API. Next slide, please. There are 4 key benefits when discussing GA4 properties, some of which obviously we've already touched on already: scalability, durability, machine learning technology, and of course, how all of these should drive a positive impact on your business. Next slide, please. But specifically for CPG organizations, GA4 will still have many of the same benefits of Universal Analytics as far as a robust API. You'll still be able to use user groups in your Google marketing platform and other automation and programmatic capabilities that allow us to roll out changes or updates at scale to your large organization. As mentioned before, the streamlining of key touch points and events across hundreds of digital assets can now be done with the click of a toggle in the GA4 UI. And really the value of these automatic enhanced measurement events cannot really be overstated. These events provide valuable data points, but require no updates within your tag management system, nor requirements from your development teams, which we all know can become significant hurdles and bottlenecks. So put simply, GA4's event and parameter-based measurement allows for flexible custom reporting rather than some of the issues we come across in universal analytics with hit scope versus user scope versus session scope dimensions simply not blending together well in custom reports or in the interface. And finally, while this presentation won't be going into detail because it would honestly merit its own 30-minute session, it's absolutely worth checking out some of the machine learning, AI capabilities, and automated reports that GA4 generates. Next slide, please. So what should you do right now? First and foremost, I would suggest taking an inventory of your current Universal Analytics events, custom dimensions, custom metrics, and goals, and begin translating them into the GA4 framework. Begin working on this with your analytics and development teams because you need to start understanding how to most efficiently deploy these changes across a large number of websites. Then, and perhaps most importantly, be sure to dual tag your website right away with GA4 so that you can at least begin to collect that basic page view and enhanced measurement data immediately. And finally, I would recommend familiarizing yourself with the GA4 interface and consider some hands-on training. For me, at least, the best way to learn a new platform is to get in there, play around with it, check out the new Exploration Hub, rather than learning from screenshots or training presentations. Next slide, please. And by preparing now, your CPG organization will be rewarded later. So perhaps utilizing machine learning and an artificial intelligence can give you an edge over your competition that's likely not using it yet. Events, parameters, and conversion events can now all be configured today in your GA4 properties. So I mentioned we're not quite at full feature parity, but many of those are integrations and other low-level features. But the core of GA4 is ready to go today with events, parameters, and conversion events. You can even actually use your existing Universal Analytics data layer to capture some of those valuable data points. So don't think you need to get your development team involved right away. And before I wrap up, I do want to mention a few key concerns that we've been hearing from organizations. I'm not currently monitoring chat, but they could very well be in there right now. And that is, first and foremost, you will not experience any data loss in your Universal Analytics properties by rolling out that GA4 and doing what we describe as dual tagging. The two will live side by side as completely different tags, completely separate platforms that won't impact data collection in one or the other. And secondly, Google will not double charge enterprises using the 360 version of both Universal Analytics and GA4. So another key question we've often been getting that I wanted to try to get in front of for you all. And finally, arguably the most important part of preparing for GA4 now and getting that GA4 tag set up so you have dual tagging is to begin collecting some of that sweet month over month and year over year data for future analysis when GA4 becomes your organization's web analytics platform of truth, likely sometime next year in 2022. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll actually be handing it over to my colleague, Jake Alspaugh, for information on GA4 architecture opportunities very relevant to CPG organizations.
Thank you, Jimmy. So with our mindset on preparing for Google Analytics 4, let's take a look at what opportunities it presents in terms of account architecture. For larger organizations, this is a crucial piece of your analytics implementation. Now, I know the shift to new technologies and systems such as GA4 can be overwhelming just on its own. So overhauling your account setup may be the last thing on your mind. But this shift does present an opportunity to re-examine your account architecture and make any necessary changes. So let's see how we can take advantage of that opportunity. So as you're planning, it might be helpful to ask yourself a few questions. First, do I like my current Universal Analytics architecture? Is it working for us or against us? Are the right people able to access the right data and reports that they need for their job and do so in a timely manner? Do new team members know exactly what each property represents? Next, consider limits. Will we hit property limits in our GA accounts if we're adding GA4 properties to existing accounts? Will we need new accounts set up because of this? And finally, what data needs to be combined in a roll-up property, for example, at the enterprise level? Is this done by brand or by market or region? Having answers or at least general direction for these questions will be crucial. As Jimmy mentioned just before here, preparation is key. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some potential architectures for CPG and multi-brand organizations. So these are some common architectures we've seen used for our partners. You're certainly not limited to these, but hopefully seeing them will get the wheels turning for how you might organize your accounts at your organization. The base framework from top to bottom goes account, property, app or web data streams, then subproperties, with account being the most general and subproperty being the most specific. So how you architect your accounts here depends on a couple of things. First, who needs access to what data? For example, is your organization divided by brand or by market or region? Do certain agencies or vendors need access to specific accounts or properties? This will determine how you first break apart your accounts. And it also depends, as I mentioned earlier, on how you need to combine data. If you're combining data at the market level, you might break out your accounts that way. This way you can add roll-up properties to combine that data by market. Ultimately, find what works best for your organization. Maybe get out a whiteboard and brainstorm some options. Interview your stakeholders to see what could work best for them. Identify the pain points they're experiencing and see where you can improve. You can hit the next slide here. So as you're planning, rest assured that there is flexibility. The good news is that none of this is set in stone once you decide. So if you change your mind about your architecture or realize something's just not working as intended, you can migrate your properties between accounts as well as rename them as needed. So here we'd encourage you to simply choose the best option. Don't let perfect get in the way of good. Do a rollout test of GA4 on a couple of accounts and see what you can learn from those tests. Check in with your stakeholders and see how it's working, and then you can iterate accordingly. And to Joanna's point at the beginning of the summit, where she quoted Adam Grant, think like a scientist. Run small scale experiments on a single market and see what you can learn about your architecture from there, and then scale it up. And in terms of flexibility, this last piece is less common, but if you need a separate roll-up type property that spans multiple GA accounts, you can always add a second GA4 property to those sites. For upgraded enterprise accounts, this will have hit and cost implications, but it could be an option if you need to break away from your standardized architecture. And for organizations that aren't using the enterprise version of GA4, this second tag could be a method for getting data rolled up by brand or market for multiple sites. So all that to say, there is flexibility and use that to your advantage as you're planning. You can hit the next one here. So some even better news beyond the flexibility. For larger organizations that have dozens or even hundreds of websites, as Jimmy mentioned earlier, GA4 properties can be configured programmatically using the API. And this would include your app and web data streams, the enhanced measurement features, and the configuration tags and triggers in Google Tag Manager. It's worth mentioning that not every feature could be automated, but at minimum, you can have your properties configured and deployed across your sites. Once you have your architecture established, your GA4 rollout could be done very quickly. With the right team of engineers, GA4 properties and tags could be rolled out in a matter of hours or just a few days. We had one partner who was able to do this across 600 sites in various markets in just a couple of days. So a ton is made possible with the API. So to wrap things up on GA4, here's what we'd like you to take away if it's just a few things. First and foremost, finalize your ideal GA4 account and property architecture. Second, dual tag GA4 alongside Universal Analytics as soon as possible. Even today, you could throw up a few tags on some sites you want to test. Next, begin learning the GA4 interface. So once you have data coming in, get to know the reports, play around with some of the new features, because soon it will be your organization's source of truth. Examine the current event framework, begin translating those to GA4 events. And then finally, if you do have dozens or hundreds of sites, consider using the API. So thank you everyone for tuning in here. We did want to save some time here for any questions that may have come in, since we know GA4 is new. So Jimmy can come back and we can field those from the chat if you want to drop any questions there.
All right, guys, thank you so much. That was awesome. And the chat is alive with GA4 questions. So I hope you guys are ready. All right, so first one, what new GA4 feature or benefit do you think will be most valuable for multi-brand organizations?
I mean, I can start with an answer there. Yeah, I think I think we covered so many that are so important for CPG organizations. I think obviously the new event-based model will just allow for a lot more flexibility and custom reporting. I think the machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities allow for automated insights. That's huge. The GA4 API looks to be as robust, if not more so, than the Universal Analytics API. I think the enhanced measurement for some of the less mature organizations that today don't have an advanced data layer, don't have custom dimensions, but the fact that the enhanced measurement automatically allows for scroll tracking, file download tracking, external link tracking, video tracking, things that honestly you'd only really see in organizations with at least a middle of the line types of analytics maturity. Now you'll see from even the most basic bare bones implementations. And I think those are very valuable data points for analysts with, again, no customizations in the data layer and no customizations required in your tag management system. So there's just a couple for you. If you want to add any more, Jake.
Yeah, I would reiterate the machine learning piece for advanced organizations and then the enhanced measurement for more basic organizations. Either way, that's going to speed you up, which is crucial for a large organization where you're doing things at scale.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question from the chat. This is from Luis. How do we work on user ID? Does custom dimension equal user properties?
So that would be you'd have to use a user scoped custom parameter for user ID. Previously, again, GA4 is still evolving. We're seeing a lot of changes in the interface. Previously, that would have been known as a user property. We're now calling them user scoped custom parameters. And that's how you would capture a user ID or any other CRM ID. So that should hopefully answer that question. Definitely something Google would not have dropped in GA4.
All right, question from Abigail. What are the property limits in GA4 if accounts are organized by country view?
So it's 100, and it's the same as Universal Analytics. You can actually have your accounts can actually have both Universal Analytics properties and GA4 properties in them. As Jake was kind of alluding to, I think one of the more exciting things with GA4 is it's a fresh opportunity to start with a new architecture. So, and by doing, of course, a new architecture, you're not going to have your UA properties and GA4 properties fighting each other for those 100 maximum that you're allowed per account. It is also worth noting that there is a way to increase that. I know for sure available with Enterprise. If you have a 360 license, you can increase it to beyond 100. But with the free version, I know Google caps it typically at 100. So hopefully that helps. But hopefully you're also considering a brand new architecture, because maybe the decision to go country-based or market-based 7 or 8 years ago when you were focusing on Universal Analytics, maybe all those reasons have gone to the wayside and you're looking at an opportunity for a fresh start with GA4.
Alrighty, if we have the universal analytics version of GA360, what's the rush to move to GA4?
I'd say preparation at this point, preparing for when GA4 does become your source of truth. So the sooner you implement it on your site, the more historical data you're going to have, the more opportunities you'll have to test and learn. And then when it does become the source of truth, you'll have done all the prep work necessary.
And we don't know exactly when Universal Analytics will sunset. I know we have a few Googlers on today's call. I don't think you'll get an answer from them either. But it is going to, inevitably, they're going to stop supporting it. It will be sunsetted in the future. So, there's really no disadvantage to getting your dual tagging set up right now, as we've continued to mention, for that historical data when you begin using it as your source of truth. But, due to the inevitable future lack of support and sunsetting of it, whenever that may be, it's good to start learning GA4 now, so it won't come as a surprise and you won't have that historical data when you do start using it regularly.
Awesome. And a similar question from Ethel in the chat. We are revamping our website in 2022. Is it best to shift to GA4 when we launch our new website?
I would say keep both as you're shifting, because to Jimmy's point a moment ago, we don't know exactly when that shift will happen. So I would retain your UA property on your new site, and I would place GA4 on your current site now, and then you get all of that comparison data as you're shifting one over to the new year and then also to your new site.
All right. How would you recommend starting to position GA4 for brands and markets who are utilizing or who are used to utilizing UA data for key business decisions, and thus would need to transition over to GA4, I think, in the coming quarters?
I would say it's establishing familiarity, spend time in the report. So, to our point earlier, if you're tagging your sites now, you're beginning to collect that data. Those brands can do analysis in both platforms and get some familiarity with how those reports are changing, how they're remaining similar. So do a little bit of side-by-side analysis for now in both platforms. That way you're familiarizing yourself with the changes.
All right. Is there a certification available for GA4? This question comes from James.
That's a good. I don't know if Google has a GA4 certification yet. I honestly have not personally taken it. I know the GAIQ, which all consultants and InfoTrust, I do recommend taking for a great universal analytics exam. I know that's still focused on universal analytics because I re-upped on it recently. But do you know, Jake? I'm not sure if there's one available today. And if anyone in chat knows, by all means, feel free to reply in chat as well.
I have not seen the test yet, no.
I'm sure there will be. And I know, there's a lot of comprehensive guides on GA4, which isn't really a test, but it's a great place to read and learn. And certainly on our website, certainly on all of Google support pages. Cool. So quite a few resources, but not familiar with a certification exam in existence today.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Jake and Jimmy. I do want to keep us on schedule. This was a very insightful session on Google Analytics 4. Hopefully we answered as many of your questions as possible, the ones that Jake and Jimmy did not get to, in the chat. If you have more, please continue to drop them in the chat. Jake and Jimmy as well will be able to drop in the chat now that they're done with their presentation. And we have a few, like I said, InfoTrusters in there as well answering your questions. So please keep the questions coming. Love seeing the engagement. We will be back in 5 minutes at 2:05 to hear from a true CPG industry insider. So Kason Thimason, formerly at Estee Lauder, Sephora, Apple. So she has tons of great experience. She's currently an executive advisor advising Rakuten. So super excited for that. She'll be joined by Michael Loban, our Chief Growth Officer, who you saw earlier with Joanna Goldblatt. So see you all in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you are all keeping the energy up. I see the GA4 questions continue to pour in. Please keep those coming throughout the rest of the summit. This is awesome. Love to see the engagement. For our next session, I am thrilled to welcome a true CPG digital marketing veteran, Kason Pimason. Kason is an executive advisor on digital innovation and is currently advising Rakuten. She helps organizations use design and technology to solve meaningful problems and has delivered hundreds of digital products that have drove growth for global brands, including Apple, Estee Lauder, and Time Warner. Kason is on a mission, people, to help enterprises scale for sustainable impact. I'm also pleased to welcome back with Kason, our InfoTrust's own Chief Growth Officer, Michael Obon. Kason and Michael, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Chase. Kason, so good to see you again.
You too. It's a pleasure, always.
I'm very excited for our conversation today. You've been, as we were chatting before the session, you've been in the industry and in the space of analytics for over 15 years. So you've seen lots of changes, and certainly we are going right now through yet another round of changes. So how do you see the measurement has evolved over this time?
Yeah, I mean, I have been around for a while. So I think for the better of everyone, I think it's just becoming more consumer-centric. In the very early days of online analytics, everyone, I think, was much more tactical about what they were measuring. I remember when everyone talked about eyeballs, which I thought was a little bit disturbing, but it's really much more about consumer engagement. KPIs like net promoter scores and client lifetime value are really reflecting that, businesses really want that longer term engagement and relationship with consumers. I think the other thing, obviously, is advanced analytics. Really having businesses really understand how to use that in a meaningful way, particularly when, a lot of those advanced analytics KPIs sometimes are black boxes, right? So, how do you approach that? How do you make sure that you're getting what you need out of it? I think it's going to be a big shift. GA4 is a very good example of this, I think.
I love the plug for eyeballs measurement. It seems like we first went from eyeballs to bounce rates, and now, as you've heard from GA4, we have the next level of analytics that's going to be available to us, and hopefully they'll make it easier for us to tell the complete story of the consumer journey and not just what happened at one instance of one moment. Today's discussion or today's summit, we started this journey talking quite a bit about experimentation and testing and really taking tiny steps to success, whether it's success in yoga or success in digital marketing. How do you think about experimentation and playing these new tools, technologies, and not falling behind?
Yeah, well, what I would say is start simple. What I've seen is people try to put a lot of criteria that limit their audience sizes, which actually makes it really difficult to get statistical significance in experiments. So what I would say is, as you're starting, just keep the things that you're trying to test super simple and not have a lot of variables in those tests so that, the results that you have, one, you have a large enough audience to actually see the results. And then two, you actually have more of a correlation between, the things that you're changing and the actual results.
Yeah, I love the idea of simplicity. I think a lot of times when we start working on experimentation or tackling new objectives, we very keen on defining, well, it needs to do this, and this to be successful. And then the criteria becomes so overwhelming. And then we are looking at this of 20 different requirements, and it becomes impossible to meet all of them. And then we say, maybe we shouldn't do anything just because to take next big leap forward is going to be so difficult.
Yeah. I also would add, actually, make it easy on yourself to create the variance. So, a big lift for A to B testing, particularly around content, is creating that other variant. So I think doing simpler tests where actually creating the other variant is not a huge lift at the very beginning, actually makes it easier on people, and you get more bang for your buck, right? Because you're not having your design team actually design to creatives, having to code to creative, it sort of builds upon itself as far as level of effort.
I recently read a couple of books on how people build successful habits. And one of the things that stood out to me in those books is habits tend to stick, or activities tend to become habits when we have an easy way to win, right? When we start putting an immediate, something huge for us, and have to say, well, I need to do all of this in order to be successful. Chances are that's not going to stick. But if you can create those small habits, small successes, it will be easier for you to continue to develop and ultimately reach the goal. One of the things that is very common when meeting or talking with large enterprises is this concept of pace. Almost in every organization, I'm sure we've heard this, well, we just don't move that fast, right? Or, yeah, that sounds great, but it's going to take us a while. And there's certainly, for some projects, there's a lot of truth to that. When you migrate thousands of websites to J4, or when you're implementing a new solution, it will take time. But how have you learned to deal with pace, and how have you mastered the ability to execute at a faster scale?
Yeah, so actually, I learned this at Apple, to be honest.
Okay.
The first iteration always takes the longest, and it's a slog. I won't kid with you. And there was a saying there: you have to move slow to move fast. And essentially, the model that they use, you see this on the iPhone, essentially make one prototype that's really, really good, but it actually takes some time to prove that out, but make sure that it's right and fully working, and then you can scale it quicker, right? The thing that I think causes a lot of delays for people, especially as you're scaling, at Estee Lauder, we had over 275 e-commerce properties. The difficulty is when you're changing midstream, right? And so, it's a little painful, and it's a little bit against sort of like the agile iterative process in some ways, but really making sure that the iteration that you're deploying actually fully works, and is as elegant, as simple as possible, and then actually replicating that to scale. And just understanding that, the first time that you do something, it's always going to be hard. So have some patience and make sure that you get it right. And then you can actually build in the efficiencies. So sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, essentially.
Elegance and the simplicity, two things that really resonate with me. And yeah, absolutely, it takes time, and nobody ever said that it would be easy. If it was easy, it probably would not be worth it, right? So I appreciate that. Let's talk for a moment about implementation. A lot of times, and lately in the news, there have been this kind of debate, do we buy or do we build? And the idea of in-housing, as organizations want to bring more capabilities in-house. But then the question becomes, well, if we bring all of this in-house, do we have enough outside voices from companies that have done this across other organizations? And if we build this in-house, are we able to recruit everyone that we need? So how do you think, or in your experience at Estee Lauder, at Sephora, how have you thought about what capabilities to build versus where to rely on your partners?
Yeah, so actually, I think the key question is whether that technology or capability is going to be a differentiator for your business. Mm-hmm. So if it is a core piece of your business, if it's a core differentiator for you in the market, you should build it. And maybe not right away, but eventually have the plan to take it in-house. And the reason why is because that is the thing that differentiates you in the market. That's what you're selling. And you need to control that roadmap end to end. And essentially, you need to have the comfort that, you have to build the expertise in that particular capability or technology. So that's one. I think, is it a core differentiator for your business? If it is, you should build it in-house, at least eventually. There's also, a sort of pivot or transition phase for some businesses where they're not exactly sure if it's going to be a differentiator, or it's a totally new capability, in which case, completely buy, but understand and look out for, whether it's going to be something core to your business that you can actually, take to market in an unusual way. And then there are other things. I mean, I think, for example, like campaign management tools or GA4, to mention it again, is also another example of you would never build that, right? You would never build GA4 yourself.
Definitely not something that we would advise, because the organization, whether you're in CPG space or any other space, chances are building analytics product is not your true core competency. And that idea of what is going to become your differentiator, that's ultimately what you want to own, right? And one of the things that I've not heard before is if it's your differentiator, is you want to control the roadmap for how you're rolling it out and how you're building it. I like that angle very much personally, because it allows you to control what and when, where in other circumstances you might have to wait for a partner or for a vendor when they're ready to roll out changes. And some of the things you want to control yourself.
Yeah. And, this just came up in industry, right? Apple moving away from the Intel chip.
That's right.
So, yeah, very good example. They've reached their limit with what they can do. And essentially now they want to control it so they can control the roadmap and not be dependent on Intel. So.
And it clearly is a part of their differentiation strategy. So really fits in.
Yeah.
When it is something that is going to become a differentiator for your organization and you want to own the roadmap, means that ultimately you need to build a team and you need to hire these people to put this together. Right now, in the United States and worldwide, we are going through an interesting time when it comes to hiring, recruiting talent. So what are you looking for when recruiting people and getting team members to join your organization?
Yeah, I think there are two main things. One is integrity, particularly around data, right? So I'm sure, anyone who's done analytics has felt the pressure to say that the analytics is saying something in particular, right? So, having the wherewithal and sort of the compass to say, I need to tell the truth because the truth is important, and trusting the data and actually standing behind it is very important. And then I think the second thing is it's related, but essentially the grit to keep on iterating and to keep on challenging yourself and improving things, and having that ability to sort of self-audit and self-improve is really important. So I think two things, integrity and the ability to really self-improve and self-audit.
Yeah, when you mentioned self-audit, considering that we just actually had a session on data governance, right? And the idea of auditing what you have in place and certainly governing the process of collection of data, of analysis of data, storage of data, makes a lot of sense. In our first couple of sessions, we talked a lot about the keys to success. We talked about first-party data. We talked about the transparency when it comes to collection of data. Shafi was talking quite a bit about data governance and some of the keys to success. But if we had to reverse the question, maybe why some of the e-commerce or analytics projects fail? Do you have any watch outs for people that are attending this event and thinking about implementing things that we were discussing today? What should they be watching out for and hopefully avoid?
Yeah, so my answer to this is I wish more projects would fail.
Okay.
So, and what I mean by that is what I actually see is most wasteful from a resource and time perspective is sometimes when projects are not going well or if they're floundering a little bit, I think people are a little bit hesitant to actually pull the plug, particularly leadership. So, at least what I've seen is leadership will just focus on something else and kind of let that project limp along, which, to be honest, I think is detrimental for the project itself, obviously, because it doesn't get the focus and attention it needs to right size itself. But also at the same time, for the integrity and the morale of that team. Obviously, no one wants to say, hey, what I've been working on isn't quite working the way that I expected. But, the acceptance of that and actually moving on so that, it's not a personal thing. It's actually something that you learn from. Yeah, I mean, I think any projects, you hear this a lot. Fostering a culture of being able to fail. Everyone says it, but actually walking that walk is really difficult. And I think from a leadership point of view, sometimes we just don't do it enough deliberately.
And I think your comment about for more projects to fail, I think also can be, tell me if I'm wrong, but can be interpreted, look, we have to learn faster. And if you know that, look, this project did not work, we now know why it did not work, and we're going to apply lessons learned to the next project. Let's go. Versus kind of limping along, pretending that there is a chance, wasting resources, going in multiple directions, and then all of a sudden you're slowing down the whole company because you have a multitude of projects that are never quite finished.
Right, exactly.
Definitely an area to avoid. Since we have maybe another 10 minutes, one of the things that I wanted to chat with you about is around the trends. It's October 27 right now, and certainly holidays are right around the corner. Chances are it's going to be yet another unusual holiday season, but I think people learned that from the prior 2 years. What should we have ready from the measurement perspective, or what should we do from the measurement perspective to be ready for the next couple of months?
Yeah, so as you said, I think it's going to be yet different again. The circumstances, again, are different. I think consumer behavior is still different. What I would say from a KPIs perspective, I am a very simple, straightforward person as far as looking at analytics. So it's your regular ones. Look at your traffic as it comes into your site. Look at conversion rate. Look at new and repeat. Obviously, your sales and revenue. But the other thing that I would actually add is your time to delivery. So all over the news, everyone's been hearing about Biden going out to California to try to, I think the ports are open now 24/7, but all the issues around supply chain. Mm-hmm. So I think, it actually was a huge issue the first time around, like in 2020 for COVID. It continues to be. I don't think most people are measuring it because I think a lot of retailers are more concerned with the things that they have more control over, right? Which is the site experience and all of those kinds of things. But actually, if you think about an end-to-end experience, how long and how transparent the process is to get the actual stuff that you ordered is super important.
Yeah, I like the comment, our end-to-end experience. And because a lot of times, especially in digital marketing, we tend to obsess about acquisition and people coming to the website and still sometimes eyeballs and conversion rate. But at the end of the day, right, if you get your customer to complete the purchase and you're celebrating that, yes, we hit our goals, and then consumer that does not get the product on time, chances are they are not going to be thrilled. And it doesn't matter that marketing did its job and the other department didn't, because it all contributes to the consumer experience.
Exactly. And it's also how you handle it too. I mean, look, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. I think, just making sure that your service people have the right mindset, and that, it's just like with anyone else, right? Over communication, setting your messaging channels to over communicate about when to expect things, or if there will be delays, or, you're like, I'm seeing holiday sales now. Already. I started seeing them back in September, actually, because I think some retailers were predicting the latency in supply chain again. So it's just really about setting expectations and having that conversation with your consumer along the way, so that they, feel like they know what's going on and that they can prepare on their side.
Whenever I'm about to start working with a new organization, a new brand, especially if they have e-commerce, I go to the website, I complete 1 or 2 purchases just to test everything myself and just see how I, as a consumer, absorb what is taking place. And I did this, these 2 brands, I'm going to mention the names. And what was interesting, one brand, I completed the purchase and got an email confirming the purchase, and probably 2.5 weeks later, I just got an email, your product has been shipped. Where in my head, the expectation was, well, wouldn't it happen next day? The other brand sent me a note saying, look, we are experiencing some delays, but here is, we're gonna send you messages so you know where you are with your product. The other thing is you can log in and view the dashboard that updates by minute, so you can see where we are experiencing the delays that are taking place. And interestingly enough, both products arrived at about the same time, but I really felt much better about products from one brand that over communicated and were very clear about when I should be expecting something, and then they actually over delivered, meaning that part of the package that I received, there was a gift just to thank me for the purchase and apologizing for the delay. And the other one was just a product that was late without any type of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes such a huge difference, right? And even those moments in time, we sometimes, I think about experiences in like that one little moment, instead of actually understanding that, that one moment, that one touch point can actually make or break how they feel about you and whether they're going to actually come back again.
Because there are so many choices, right? Chances are the product that you are selling can be purchased somewhere else, or there's another or similar product that you are competing with that can, the product might be about the same, but the communication can be possibly done differently by another organization. Looking at 2022, are there some trends that you are a bit concerned about?
Well, I think, again, tying to some macro trends, sustainability is just going to come at us. I think, obviously we're seeing it in the world with climate change and things like that, but particularly in e-commerce, its model is actually not inherently sustainable, right? So, shipping products one-to-one essentially, or one-to-many creates a lot of packaging waste. It's a lot of fuel, all of these things. I think that, as businesses and as citizens, I think thinking about how you can become more sustainable, how you can become more community oriented, I think is super important. I think it will actually be much more important through time to younger people, particularly millennials and Gen Z. Just as you see, they're much more concerned about climate change. They're much more concerned about sort of social impact.
So what can be done to alleviate some of these concerns and prepare ourselves for these changes?
Yeah, I think, the first thing to do is just look at your packaging at your warehouses. So I'm sure you've gotten packages, and, this happened sometimes at Estee, less and less. but where you get a tiny little lipstick and it's in a huge box, right? So just making sure that you actually have the right packaging for the products that you're shipping out and that you're not over packaging is an easy first step. I think the second thing you'll see a lot more on the market is actually more sustainable packaging. So I ordered something from a brand called Loisel the other day, and actually it came in, a little paper envelope that actually could just be recycled if you did returns, right? So you could actually return in the same package, a fully paper product, no plastic. So I think there are a lot of things just around packaging that you can look at, particularly for smaller businesses. And then I think for larger businesses, it's about distribution. It's about how do you get those products closer to the consumer so that you aren't actually, shipping it across the country, for example.
And I think both items really contribute to the overall consumer experience, right? And a lot of times, if consumer sees that organization might be wasteful when it comes to shipping products, that might be something that they will reconsider when making another purchase or perhaps going with another organization. So yet again, that need for us to truly understand the consumer experience and everything that it entails.
Yeah, and actually Amazon started doing it, but I actually saw Target doing it first, is, the consolidation of your packages, right? Yes. So, hey, instead of having like 2 separate packages, you can actually consolidate them. This happens a surprisingly large number of times where multiple orders will come from one person. I've actually seen this during holiday, and actually just consolidating those products into one package could make a big difference.
As we are ending bringing the session to conclusion, do you have any recommendations for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, again, I sort of made this leap myself, but I think there's definitely something in the air, particularly around COVID, to think about how you make an impact on the community and a wider social impact. So I think from a market point of view, from a consumer point of view, everyone's looking for that younger consumer to sustain them and grow them. It will be around social impact, and it will be around being better citizens. And it's just a good thing to do overall. So I think look at your business, see what you can do just to improve things for yourself and your community overall.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end the session on. Be a better citizen and think about the social impact that you're making. Keysan, always a pleasure. I do have one more question for you. How's the training going? If I recall correctly, you are training for the New York Marathon.
Yes, it's almost here.
Yes, it is.
Goodness. I have one more 10-mile run this Saturday. So.
Excellent. Well, good luck. I know Cincinnati Marathon I'm participating in is this Sunday. Have fun. New York Marathon is an amazing experience and enjoy it.
Thank you. Good luck to you too.
Thank you. Back to you, Chase.
Keysan and Michael, thank you so much. That was awesome. Keysan, I have a sticky note written down right now. I'm going to go on my desk. You have to move slow to move fast. That was awesome. So thank you for that. So we are going to go into one more break. But before that, you will notice in the YouTube chat, we're going to be dropping a second form link. So please fill that out before Michael gets to the closing remarks. We're going into one more session right now on server-side GTM, and then we'll have a wrap up at the end of the day. But just please fill out that form before the summit is over. It's just kind of an overview, what you think of the day, things that you think we missed that we should touch on at our next summit. And then also it's going to let us know that you are sticking around for the Peloton drawing at the end. So again, Keysan, Michael, thank you very much. We will be back in 4 minutes for a session on server-side GTM from Ben Fisher at Google and Tyler Blatt at InfoTrust. See you in a few minutes.
Thanks, guys.
And we are back. So thank you everyone for sticking with us. I know virtual events can sometimes be tiring after a while, but we do have an exciting session on server-side GTM in 2022 coming up right now. So I'd like to introduce Ben Fisher. Ben is a product manager at Google and is passionate about the evolution of tagging, web analytics, and a healthier, privacy-centric internet. Also joining Ben is our own Tyler Blatt. Tyler is a lead analytics engineer at InfoTrust and a Google Cloud certified cloud architect, as you can see by his awesome sweatshirt badge. So take it away, Ben and Tyler.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the intro, Chase.
Thanks, Chase.
Go ahead, Ben. Sorry. Yeah, so today we'll be diving into just an overview of server-side GTM. And really the goal is going to be, I know, in the CPG space, but really all around the world, there's a lot of confusion around when do we go to server-side, what kind of problems is it solving, what's the real value proposition. There's just a lot of unknowns on what it is. And that's what we're hoping to dive into today. And hopefully you come out of this session knowing start of next year, what are my plans? How can I get involved? What's the best way that I could be utilizing these services in 2022? So it's a short session with a lot of info packed into it. So we're going to dive in and I'm going to go over the agenda real quick on what you can expect to get out of this. So first, Ben and I are going to discuss what is server-side tag management. So just from the concept, if you're not even familiar with what's really happening, we'll go over what is server-side tag management, followed by pain points of the traditional tag management system. So client-side tag management systems have some problems, and that's why the rise of server-side and the popularity has been so relevant recently. Then, once we've identified those client-side problems, we'll address how is server-side actually addressing them. How can we expect server-side to squelch those problems we're going through? We'll go through a brief overview of what server-side GTM is going to look like, and then finally, we'll talk a little bit on what you need to get started with server-side GTM, so you can kind of understand the investment. So with that, we'll jump into the section where we explain a little bit about what is server-side tag management. We can go to the next slide. So for this first slide, I think it's important when we're talking about what is server-side tag management to understand exactly how client-side tag management works. Essentially, what you're doing on with client-side tag management is you're downloading a GTM container to your website. What that means is you're using JavaScript code to reach out and actually load a GTM container on your website. And what that GTM container is going to do is load other third-party JavaScript libraries to your website as well. So you actually are running all of this code on your site, and then that code needs to make requests out to third-party APIs from your site. So not only are you loading more JavaScript code, but it's also sending data out to those third-party client libraries.
Yeah, that's how I said. So using a tag manager is still more efficient than placing these tags directly on your site, but each third-party script is loading directly, even if through the GTM container.
Exactly. We can go to the next slide. And so where this gets interesting, and this is specifically a problem that I see a lot of CPGs companies facing, is how do we deal with that at scale? Because in reality, we want to have uniform tracking. We want to be able to track, if we have 100 plus sites and we want to be able to report on them in the same way or be able to collect data in the same way, how do we manage the standardization of those containers and that JavaScript and all of that loading and all of the rules and logic that comes to collecting that data across all of these sites when we have to individually load this code on each site where we know sites may behave differently? There are two techniques that I should say are being used in the space that I see a lot. One is a global container. So you decide all the data that you're going to collect comes from your data layer on the individual site basis, and that data layer will configure where it's going to send the data. But the mechanism or instructions for collecting data from GTM remain completely standardized globally. They're all the same across all sites. And then some sites will employ a local container process where they'll use clever APIs and mass functionality to try to enforce the same rules across many different containers and enforce standardization at scale that way. Both are, and I've actually seen some companies doing both of those. They have a global standard and they try to keep a local standard as well to give a little bit more leeway. But you need a lot of processing and a lot of industry knowledge to be able to achieve uniform scaling on the client side for data collection. We can go to the next slide. And so with that, we jump into the server-side example and how it's different. So with server-side, if we need to consolidate and go at scale, you could actually, you could employ similar techniques, but what's beautiful is you can actually manage the standardization of those within your server-side containers. So you could point the event stream of 2 websites through your server-side container, and you can actually store off your event stream in BigQuery as well. One really big piece of information to call out here is this server-side code, or the client-side JavaScript, all those libraries and all the things that we were loading on the website, some still will need to load and configure IDs, but for the large majority of your measurement, that code doesn't need to run on the website anymore. So we've moved all of that processing and that requesting off into the server-side container, which is going to have big impacts on your page.
Yeah, that's a really important point Tyler made right there. There's a difference between server-side tagging and other server-to-server forms of measurement. And I think in the industry, there's a lot of confusion as to what is server-side tagging versus what is a server-to-server approach or an S2S API and things like that. So when talking about server-side tagging here, the way that Google recommends customers use server-side tagging is what we call a hybrid approach, which, as Tyler said, means you're able to drastically consolidate the amount of JavaScript on your site and rely on a single or a couple of tags in each of your site to handle the data collection for all of your measurement tools. And then, as Tyler mentioned, you send that to server containers. It can be from multiple websites, and that's where you have all the control to do things with the data, fan it out, and manage it in one environment. So hybrid approach is a key thing to take away from kind of this mechanism. As you see, you still have the line going from the website to the server container. You can't magically collect that data without having some tags on site, but that's the approach we take.
Perfect. And with that, I think we're ready to jump into what are the pain points that we're solving from traditional TMS. From this section, we're going to try to identify what are the things that are coming up that are making server-side so interesting.
Yeah, and a quick thing, there are a bunch of like pain points we are directly trying to tackle with server-side GTM, but also it's one of Google's main levers we are using to help future-proof advertisers measurement. So like one of the beauties of it that we won't touch on here really, because it's not a direct pain point today, but how do we make sure that as the privacy and regulatory landscape evolves, you are able to quickly adapt to it as an advertiser, right? And we allow you to take advantage of new privacy-centric features that we roll out and adjust to the kind of constrictions in terms of what data you can collect and the policies you have to ensure and things like that. So it's not just like a standalone platform today. It's also a way of us making sure that you are prepped for the next couple of years of privacy craziness.
Yep, we absolutely see it as a long-term strategy position to at InfoTrust. So when I can, I'll touch on those points as much as I can here as we go through some of these pain points that we'll go through. This one, I won't stay on as long, but one of the things that's essentially difficult on client side, and I've already touched on, is figuring out how do we manage that scale. So we've already talked about that a little bit. You also have the concepts of is your data layer standard. So you don't really see what's going on the client side. There's JavaScript that's running and triggering tags and passing data off. But when you have that event stream coming into your controlled environment in the cloud, you then can monitor that event stream and understand which sides are collecting things that aren't standard to that event stream. You actually can be the watcher on the wall, kind of understand what's going on. So one of the things is managing a standard data layer is very difficult on the client side. Managing the tags firing the same way, and then a real big one is compliance. Understanding, what data am I collecting and where. It's a little bit harder to see what's going on. It just seems like a place that there's not a lot of visibility. So another huge piece, and I touched on it a little bit on that last side, is the security and governance of all the data that you're collecting on client-side tag management systems can be just a nightmare for companies to try to track down. Essentially, tags are configured to fire other tags, to fire other tags. You don't know what tags are firing what. JavaScript can be difficult to track down as far as what it's doing. And then if you have a leak or the PII is sent somewhere, but that tag piggybacked off another tag, and that PII was sent to multiple places, and you need to be able to get there and delete it, managing just the security risks of JavaScript being able to piggyback and the governance of what you're collecting, where you should be sending it, and what's happening becomes very, very difficult with traditional TMS.
Yeah, that's a big selling point for our advertisers is they want to avoid data leakage scenarios. And although there are a lot of things in client-side GTM that allow you to ensure that tags aren't collecting or accessing things in the page they shouldn't be, such as policies and things you can do with sandbox JavaScript, right? At the end of the day, the fewer third-party tags you need to run on your site, the better. The easier it is to manage those kinds of policies. And you don't have to write them around all the tags. You just know there's one tag doing something on my site and the rest of it is controlled in a secure server environment where I determine exactly what each third-party platform should see. Also, really quickly, I want to check in that the full slide is showing Chase. On our screen, it looks like it might not be. You good?
Okay. Yeah, I believe it's good. I've got the live stream on.
Yeah, you guys are good.
Thanks.
So speaking of moving JavaScript off the page for security reasons, it also has site speed reasons. So the more that we're moving things off, and not only is it just better for leakage and general governance, but it's better for site speed. Each individual tag actually has to be loaded on client side, like we talked about. It actually gets downloaded in, and then it's also making requests out. It's important to understand too, tags are very light. They're easy to load, but on individual computers, each individual device, there's a limited number of TCP/IP connections. I know most of you aren't engineers and you're like, Tyler just said a bunch of letters. But what that means is you can think of you have like 4 highways, 8 highways, 16 highways to load data in. And if everybody's trying to use those highways, that's all you have. So even if they're fast, you're waiting on them all to take turns loading those things out. As you limit those, the resources will load much faster. And when we're talking about less populated areas of the world, cell phone connections, the performance you're going to get in markets where internet is much more of a valuable commodity, it'll drastically increase your abilities there. And I'll talk a little bit more of the values of that later. But it's definitely going to increase your site speed performance. We can jump into the next one. And this is, so if you were sitting there thinking, yeah, but how bad is the JavaScript on my website? How many piggybacking tags? This is actually, I've cropped out what client this is from, but this is a live client's website, and this is only the top half of the image. I zoomed in a little bit, and there's a whole bottom half of this image of tags piggybacking off of tags. All of these are loading on all page views. So when we talk about those highways getting blocked up, we talk about knowing where we're sending data. We talk about governing all of this, understanding the data layer rules to send all of this. It becomes such a wide thing to measure and to understand where my data is ending up, where it's going. And this is more of a shock slide just to show this is how complicated this can get. I'll go through this one very quickly, but this one's in here for, I should state the reason. I think everybody probably is aware of what a third-party cookie is. And if at this point you aren't, essentially the functionality, I'm not going to read through the slide as much as to say, this is how, through some clever redirecting change, that third-party advertisers have been able to share their IDs and personally target users. So you can say, I want to target to this person. This is how they've been able to identify users, and this technology is being deprecated. The reason that I bring this up is a lot of the client-side tags that you're loading rely on this. And when we talk about long-term activation strategy, and as Ben stated, Google's ability to provide you with the ability to use tools that come out, own your own first-party data, and be agile in your advertising stack in the most compliant way, it's important to understand that you are losing something with the current state of client side. And GTM, while it might not completely fix the problem, fill that hole, it is positioning you to be agile in that space so that you can find the solutions for it. Another interesting one that I see with people a lot is they get upset where we're like, hey, we have our transactions loading on the back end, and we know we had 80% transactions, and we think what's happening is we actually have JavaScript blockers that are missing. We've checked this up, and the thing is, because it's loading on a customer's computer, JavaScript can be blocked. It can be stopped. There's plugins to do this. There's Chrome plugins. There's softwares that say, hey, anything that's not part of this core website's library, don't load it. I don't want to load anything else. Like, I don't want any of these other trackings. And there's really nothing you can do about it. Now, I should say, if we're talking about getting around JavaScript blockers, it is very important to be compliant. I'm not saying that, hey, we should just collect it whether they want to or not. But I am saying if you've done everything to be compliant and you've gotten the proper access, it can be a pain to have JavaScript blockers just stopping everything that you're trying to collect.
Yeah, that's how I alluded to. Like, the point is that we're helping you consolidate your measurement around kind of first-party measurement as much as we can, meaning you own where the scripts are loaded from, you own where the data goes to prior to being sent to other places. You set more of the cookies yourself as opposed to these third-party tags doing it and things like that. So that gives you more control, both as like the browsers and regulations evolve, but also as we roll out new things, we can give you tools to help you do that.
Exactly. And then we got one more as far as the pain points, then we're going to jump into the exciting stuff of how GTM's solving it, which, Ben and I can't help but talk about it a little bit already. Essentially, your data is going all over the place. When you're collecting data from the client side, all of the data that's being collected exists in one place at one time. It's all sitting there, and you're distributing it to a bunch of other platforms. You're saying, I want to send this piece over here, this piece over here, and you really don't own a lot of it for yourself as much as you're sending it out in a lot of places. So there's often, and this will lead into the value proposition, spoiler alert, of owning your own first-party data sets. But a problem that I hear from a lot of people is like, I just need access to my data now. And I have to wait on processing times here, and there's no ID to link to this one and figuring these pieces out. And so having that distributed data is a core problem you see a lot with client side because you just don't own that raw data set. All right, so how does GTM solve these problems, or server-side GTM, that is? We'll try to, we have another 2 more sections of slides, so I'm going to try to go quicker through this one, but please feel free as we go through this, drop questions in the chat, and if you feel like you want to know anything more, we'd love to be engaged in this, so we're never afraid to get involved. So I can touch for this one like really quickly. It's not too complicated to understand, and especially since time's tight, I'll just touch on this. Everything in the red box where we showed tags loading on your web, that's all client side. So when I talked about those TCP IP connections, or like, where internet is a more of a scarce commodity, you're fighting for internet for all those. And that big scary image I showed with all those tags piggybacking, that's a nightmare in those scenarios, where everything in the red box on the right side for your client side is client side, and everything else happens server side. Now, while you might have to fire one Google Analytics tag, one Google Ads tag locally to get IDs, the measurement is minimized, which means you're going to increase your SEO scores and your general site performance, which studies have shown increase essentially your KPIs. Okay, this is another big one, and then I think one of the core value propositions to server side is just the mess of security and governance around client side, and how it sort of is trivialized with server side. You control the black box in which you're collecting data and where you're sending it. It's no longer a thing where the client can interfere, softwares can interfere. So there's so many rules and a mess of logic to navigating that web, or those images I've been showing of tags piggybacking off of tags. Another big piece, this links a little bit back to the site speed performance, is because you're processing and using the network that way, it's very expensive on the client's performance. You're paying for that in client performance. So moving it to the cloud, you can have a little bit easier environment where it's cheaper to pay for that performance. So you're getting better value. Consoling your pipeline to an event stream means you can monitor that event stream and know exactly the standardization of what data you're collecting. So if you're missing user ID, it's going to become very obvious to you because your event stream's coming in and you control the box that it's coming into. If you're missing certain pieces, governing the data and the strategy is all coming into one single box that you can have the logic put on to understand what's happening and how to react to it. Versus when things go missing on the client side, you have to wait for it to go into an API downstream, and then all of a sudden things aren't showing up, and this floodlight didn't collect data, and now the advertising's over. It's a nightmare, versus you can actually see it coming in and solve the problems as it comes in. This is a weird one. And it depends on if you need IDs for the platform. But if you have a platform that you don't need to do a handshake for an ID on an individual user, you also can own your own raw data set, and you can potentially replay some data into that platform if the platform supports it. So that's another piece where if you own your event data historically, you have the ability to kind of replay it in any direction that you want to. Though this would take a little bit of software, but it is allowing you to solve that problem long term.
Yeah, and the consolidating data stream one is really important for data governance. Like think traditionally when you want to update what data you send to a certain third-party platform, you have to update the tag and then redeploy the tag, and you're actually making changes to your page. Whereas in server-side GTM, you configure that one event stream once from your client side, and then you send it to your server container, and you can more dynamically adjust what data should be exposed to what tags, then sent to what platform without doing any redeployment of your client-side container. So less management, less interference, and much more control.
Perfect. This is a really interesting one as well. You're no longer injecting. This is a bit of a misnomer. You are still injecting some JavaScript, but you're not injecting as much JavaScript to the page. So from that perspective, it's a little bit easier to alter your measurement downstream without actually having to inject code to the website. Now, I'm not saying that on the week before Black Friday, you should be messing with your measurement containers. But what I will say is if you have measurement downstream that doesn't need JavaScript on page, it's a little bit safer to alter your measurement strategy closer to the holiday period when you're doing it in a web container that doesn't affect the website at all, versus potentially bringing down website functionality before, a large holiday period. So I think the potential decoupling of measurement down the road, and the further it goes that way, lends yourself to be a little bit more agile in stressful periods. So you can test some new measurement or get out some new tags or new functionality in a time where no one's touching the website.
That's a terrific point. And also it means that you can iterate more quickly because you don't need as much IT and engineering collaboration to actually update your measurement.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's one that's been a little slept on in the community, but that is a very strong value proposition, especially very topical. In a month, everyone's going to be thinking, I got to get this tag out. What do I do? And that's something that if you're able to iterate more quickly in a little bit more safe of environment, I think that's a pretty big value proposition.
It's a great point, Tyler.
So we touched on this one quite a bit, and I highlighted in here as well. It's important to still be durable and compliant with your strategies that you're coming in. So with your ability to store everything, maybe not store everything and make sure that you should be compliant in what you're storing. However, as long as you're following a compliant strategy, there's no reason when your event streams are flowing through this server-side container that you don't just drop all your data into BigQuery. If you think about what analytics data is, and we talked about GA4 quite a bit today. When you think about even though the GA4 model is essentially what is everything on a website? Well, it's essentially a user interacting with your website with some sort of identity graph tied to it and other metadata. So it's a user doing something and then some other pieces of information on that person. And if all data is essentially built into this structure that can be applied then anywhere, why not store raw forms of that in BigQuery to where you can get action to it fast, and you can get the ability to own your own first-party data set long-term. So this opens up quite a bit of options and is what I think is a first step to a large first-party data storage strategy. Later come like CDPs and things like that. But this is a step in the right direction, getting you to where you can fully blow out an environment in your cloud where you own your data. This is an interesting one, and while maybe not the most important in the world, I do think it's one that solves a problem that some people are highly focused on in the industry. So when you're deploying a server-side GTM container, which we'll talk about later, but essentially anywhere that a Docker container can go, that allows you to put your own custom URL on it. When you put your own custom URL on it, I talked earlier when I was talking about JavaScript blocking. This doesn't get around JavaScript blocking necessarily, but for the way that it works, they will say, if it's not this URL or it's not this list of URLs, we have to load this because it could be website functionality. So one of the ways you can stop your tags from being essentially blocked is if in the example, and this is an image from Google's description of server-side tag manager, example.com is loading in this website container. What we actually can do is do data collection.example.com at example.com, and now there's no way to differentiate if this is core website functionality or if it's collecting things. So through your own ability to collect through the URL, you can circumvent people that are doing nefarious blocking. And I will say this again, even though I've said it a bunch, you still need to be compliant in what you're collecting. Don't just collect everything now because there's no rules and it's behind your URL. There absolutely still are rules, but this is a way to stop that style of blocking, or at least circumvent some of it.
Yeah, one of the other benefits of collecting your own URL is the ability to set cookies from your server, and it's hosted on your own domain. And this provides some increased durability in terms of the longevity of cookies and things like that. So it's not meant as a means of circumventing browser policies. It's one of the benefits of consolidating your measurement. So everything that's being loaded on the page, cookies being set, are all from your first-party domain. So that's a bit more technical, and then we have more documentation on that. But actually, it does improve measurement durability immediately in some ways.
Yeah. And that I like the intention of when you have the kind of the client side problem and third-party cookies, as it goes down the piggyback chains, they're like, we don't know who's setting what and where it's coming from. Where when it's coming from your first-party domain, your server-side container, you're saying, we are setting this. We want this to be here. It's a bit more explicit and fits into the narrative of being compliant, but then still having a good durable stack.
Absolutely.
All right. This is a huge one. Most people have probably put this together at this point, but enriching data. So if we're getting the ID, if we're getting a Facebook ID, we're getting Google Client ID, we have Google Click ID, we have a nest of IDs or data that we've collected, and I'll say for the millionth time, in a compliant way. And we're consuming them into our container, we're setting that identity graph up for every hit. So if that identity graph's going up with every hit, and you want to link Facebook ID to client ID, you can store Facebook ID in a custom dimension, or you can start finding ways to enhance the data, both going out to different server payloads, so where you're sending out to different third-party APIs, and then you also have that identity graph stored yourself for your own enhancement that you can link to a CRM or a CDP. So the ability to understand and map all of this data that's been consolidated to the places it's going opens up quite a lot of options for data enrichment.
Yeah, and there are ways that you can do this today, right? We have a native way to write to BigQuery, but we're also building a lot of cool functionality that helps you more easily pull data from your various data stores and filter, augment, redact, enrich, right? So Tyler focused on the enrichment piece. Like a classic example would be passing profit instead of revenue to some analytics tool. But there's also the value in being able to like augment this data prior to sharing it out with other tools. And a good example would be like if you look at some of the consent frameworks in the EU, they say that for unconsented hits, you can't share any personal information. And so you could use server-side GTM to redact or anonymize your IP address, or make sure all the PI is scrubbed prior to sharing it. So it really gives you that more control, which will both make sure you're compliant, but also unlocks more insights you might have previously lost.
Amazing point. All right, we're getting a little bit closer to time, so I'll try to speed up through this, but a real quick example here. Time to insights, I think, is a really cool one. And I know there's one customer that is listening that's going to be interested in this. Every year, they stand up a holiday dashboard to project their revenue over the course of the day. And they are in the CPG space. It's a prediction engine that will project the revenue over the course of the day, and we have to run it through essentially third-party collection systems that we wait on their response. There's processing time to getting that data. Well, if it just drops in BigQuery in real time, we can access that data when it was collected. As it went through the GTM container, it was dropped in BigQuery, and we're ready to consume it. So anything where I need the insights now, I can do my own logic on it. I don't need to rely on it for figuring out, what marketing campaign became, any kind of attribution models. I just want the raw data, some dashboard directly. You can use this as a really fast way to collect your data at speed. And with that, since we're on low time, I'm going to try to we'll go quick through these last bit of slides. They shouldn't take too long. The big thing that I want to show with server-side GTM, we're not going to go too far into the weeds because I know most of you probably aren't engineers, but I just want to show exactly what this title says. It's the same GTM, new features. So when you go to stand up a server-side tag management container, it's no different than when you've done a web, iOS, Android, all AMP containers in the past. It's the same interface. You should be comfortable with it. It's just new features being added to this. There are some extra steps down the road to actually get it deployed, but from your interfacing and understanding how you're going to work with the tags, it should feel very much at home. They've done a great job with the UI here. Going over tags real quick, it isn't a huge list of feature tags, but they're definitely core to the use case. These are the tags that are currently supported by the platform. There's more tags to come, but for now, these are the tags that are currently supported by the platform. Mainly being Google Analytics tags, Floodlight tags, Google Ads tags. And then a really important one for you to notice at the bottom there is that HTTP request. You do have the ability to configure to go to places you need it to go. So you can work with the platform to figure out if there's something that's absolutely crucial that is not on this list or not on the list I'm about to show you after, which I'll show you what template tags are after, then you can figure out how to support it with that HTTP request.
Yeah, and really quickly, I know we're pretty much out of time, but people get scared off when they hear server anything, and they think that it's very technical and hard to manage. But the point I want to make here is you are not learning a new skill. You already have people at your companies that use Google Tag Manager in many cases, and it's the familiar interface with many new benefits. So I think that's the point that Tyler and I really want to get across here.
For sure. Yeah, well summarized. And really quickly, if we can jump to the template tag page, and then we can, I'll go over that very quick, and then we'll jump to 2 slides forward to the just getting started. Then we can wrap up there. It should be very short. So what this is a template library created by other parties, where essentially they've used that functionality, which Ben might be able to explain a little better than I could, to create functionality for different APIs. So these aren't in that core library list, but these are templates that other parties have created saying, hey, we figured out how to do Facebook conversion API tag, use our template library, and you can just pull this tag in. Or you want to send Slack notifications when a certain error message comes through, someone's figured out a template library for that. So these are just libraries to help extend the functionality, and the community can help really build out tags very quickly using these templates.
Yeah, and just like a little snippet here. Facebook actually recommends server-side GTM as their de facto way of writing to their conversions API, because it's so much simpler than writing to the API directly, and it's an easier way to manage it and control the data flow. So some traction in the market, it'll continue to grow. It also means that if you have measurement partners that you don't see on this list that you want to add to it, they're able to, and we're able to work with them to do that.
Yep, and then we'll just read this last slide. We don't have to go too far into it, but just for an idea about how you're going to get started with this, essentially, you need a GCP project, or if you're not on GCP or don't want to use GCP, you just need an environment where you can deploy a Docker image. If you plan to add a domain name to it, you'll need the network IT team to buy in and work with you to essentially set up the AA records and point, DNS to your server. A budget for hosting, which I'll let Ben make a point that isn't completely necessary in a minute, and essentially just some engineering capacity to initially set this up. So you have to have somebody. It will take an engineer for the initial setup for a small amount of time, but as Ben said previously, once you get to actually running the tags in the container, you don't. At that point, it's the same old GTM.
Yeah, we have a cool little wizard in the GTM UI that actually allows you to deploy the server resources and do a free trial, more or less, without any technical knowledge, without leaving GTM at all, without going to GCP. And so you can start sending traffic, see what it's like, play around with it, and then easily upgrade to a production mode, which has redundant servers and things like that. So the overhead cost to at least explore it is none, which is pretty cool.
Awesome. And with that, I think we're at the end of it. We used up a little bit more time. So Chase is going to come in and yell at us in a second. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to submit them. I love it. If you can't tell, I really like this stuff. So I'd love answering it. And thank you all for joining and listening to us talk about this.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ben and Tyler. And I would never come in and yell at you guys. So we highly appreciate the session. Super informative. We are going to move, actually right now, we're going to nix the final break that we had scheduled. And we are going to dive right into the closing remarks with InfoTrust Chief Growth Officer, Michael Lobin. Again, before we do that, I do want to mention in the YouTube live chat, there is a second form link. A number of you have already filled it out. Thank you very much. Please, if you have not filled it out, go ahead and do so quickly now. So that is going to do two things. It's going to, one, tell us your thoughts on the day. We certainly want feedback, and we'll be working to improve our next summit. We have a finance and a retail analytics summit coming up in the spring. Those are two different summits, so look out for those. But we want to take any feedback you have from this summit and apply it there. And of course, we'll be back with another CPG summit in fall 2022. So all your feedback is super helpful. Also, that is going to confirm to us that you have attended throughout the duration of today's summit, so you will be eligible for the Peloton drawing. So please do that quickly. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael Lobon.
Thank you, Chase. To summarize something like this is not a small feat. We spent the past 4 hours talking about digital analytics, experimentation, testing, certainly covered a lot of ground. And one of the things that I do when I attend very informative sessions, webinars, seminars, conferences, is thinking ahead 6 months from now. Where do I want to be? How do I want to succeed in the current role, or as part of the organization, as part of the company? And what are some of the learnings that would help me get there? Because certainly it's impossible to act on everything that was discussed today. And so using that frame of mind, let's maybe think about all of the sessions and topics that we covered today, and see if we can pinpoint some of the themes and areas that stood out. Now, initially, when we started the session, we talked with Joanna. I think the pillar of everything that we've been discussing is it's consumer first. Whatever we do, whatever strategy we decide to focus on, it has to be consumer centric. And when we talk about the CPG space, it's about, well, how do we collect first party data? And hey, if we're going to collect first party data, how do we do it in a very transparent fashion to make sure that consumers understand what we are collecting about them, how we are collecting the data about them, and what we are going to do with the data. And something that Joanna called out that's really important is the application of data, right? Before we even start collecting the information, we need to be very mindful about what are we going to do with that information, how it's going to be applied. Then we've talked about experimentation, and that's something that was called out by Joanna as well as by Keysan later in sessions today, is when we talk about the work that needs to happen, well, instead of doing everything at once, let's figure out what are the small experiments that we can make and how can we really position ourselves to succeed. And we've talked about experimentation from the strategy standpoint. What are the strategic initiatives that we can play with, experiment? We've talked about possibly bringing in new partners that we can experiment with, and certain experimentation with new tools. And later in discussion, we had presentations on J4 and just finished a presentation on server-side GTM with Tyler and Ben. And towards the end of Joanna's presentation, we also talked about what are some of the questions that we need to be considering as we are planning ahead. First of all, putting yourself in a customer, in a consumer's shoes, is this something that you would want a company to do to you as a consumer? What are some of the long-term metrics, and what is our long-term success? And is it really going to be sustainable? How do we continue to be outcome-focused and continue to build on a success? So all of those things were discussed just in the first 45 minutes of today's summit. And then since first-party data collection and being consumer-centric is so important, we've heard Shafi and Lucas talk about data governance and the importance of truly understanding consumer expectations and all of the changes that are happening right now in the industry, from regulatory changes by different governments around the world. And when you work for a multi-brand CPG organization, you certainly need to be mindful of all of the changes across the world as different brands, different websites are impacted by laws and regulations across different countries. We've talked about how consumer expectations are changing, and consumers are now a lot more mindful about the data that is being collected about them and how the data is going to be used. And certainly technology changes that are happening right now that we need to be mindful of. And Shafi called out the importance for transparency, the importance for data governance, data compliance, and establishing a global data structure. And talking about all of the changes that are happening, especially on regulatory side and the technology side, when we think about technology space and when we think about the tools that we have access to, is how do we have a durable technology stack? How do we build it to last? And today we've heard the presentation about the GA4 and how it is going to be the future of analytics. And we just had a great presentation on server-side GTM. And a couple of other things to call out that stood out to me from the discussion this Kei-san, and I've been fortunate to work and spend time with Kei-san over the past couple of years, and how insightful she is, never seems to amaze me, always seems to amaze me. And she talked about move slow to move fast, right? The tiny wins that we can make, and how do we learn and fail fast, right? And at the end of the day, if something is not working, there is no shame in saying this did not succeed, but this is what we've learned, and now we are going to direct our resources to something else. And when we talk about implementation, when we talk about build versus buy, well, what is that one differentiator that we are going to focus on, and how we are going to really build that in-house so we can control our roadmap? And look, we are going through interesting, challenging, unprecedented times. And sometimes what we are planning to do, sometimes the products that we are planning to send out tomorrow, or that need to be shipped in 1 week, or need to be delivered in 1 week, might not get there on time. So how do we over communicate with our consumers? And it's not just about shipping, but it is also about data collection. It's also about data application. And something that is really true when we think about putting consumer first. Well, if we are putting our customer, if we are putting consumer first, we need to over communicate with them so we have that transparency. And that's something that consumers will absolutely appreciate. And Kei-san ended the presentation on the importance of social impact and how important that is. So as I'm thinking through all of these sessions and the topics that were covered today, probably a couple of themes that come to mind that I drafted as I was preparing for the closing remarks, if you will. One is, we've talked about all of the changes. Well, the best thing about these changes that are happening right now is that these changes really unify all, and these changes happen to all organizations in the same fashion, right? So this is our opportunity within the new reality, within the privacy-centric world that we now live in, to innovate, right? So we have opportunity and responsibility for all of us. We need to develop culture of testing and easy wins, because as we've discussed, those easy wins are helpful in creating habits for our organization. And we have the responsibility to our organization as well as to our customers to be thinking long-term, as well as short-term, but never just short-term. And ultimately, let's focus on small motions, small wins, so we can get to our first headstand, so we can finish our first marathon, whether it's running or running a digital strategy in your organization. And considering that Adam Grant has been called out a couple of times by a number of speakers in today's presentation, I thought it would be only appropriate to finish the session with a quote from Adam Grant. It takes confident humility to admit that we are a work in progress. It shows that we care more about improving ourselves than proving ourselves. And I think when it comes to digital measurement and digital analytics, we are all work in progress. And good luck to all of us. Back to you, Chase.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. That was a great summary of the day. Thank you again to everyone who attended. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us at infotrust.com. We have, as you saw today, a number of experts on any of the topics discussed, GA4, data science, privacy. So we would love to chat with you. Now, the moment I think many of us have been waiting for, the Peloton giveaway. So first of all, just thank you again to all of our speakers, to Shafi, to Kason, to Ben, to Joanna. We are just absolutely thrilled to have you as part of this event. We definitely want to return again for the 3rd annual CPG and Multi-Brand Digital Analytics Summit in 2022. So definitely be on the lookout for that. We are hoping that there will be an in-person element to that event as well. So fingers crossed there. All right, it is time to spin the wheel and give away a Peloton. All right, if you want to spin it. All right, Carlos Herzog, congratulations on your new Peloton. Someone from the InfoTrust team will be reaching out shortly to talk about shipping. Thank you so much, everyone. Have an awesome Wednesday, and we can't wait to see you all again sometime.